The burrow leaned at its familiar angle beneath a leaden December sky. But this time it looked as though the wind might finish what bad carpentry and enthusiastic magic had started, push the whole precarious tower of rooms and chimneys and patched-on extensions into the frozen earth. Harry paused at the gate, his gloved hand finding Ginny's automatically, as if his fingers had learned long ago that they were steadier when they were holding on to her. Their breath drifted in pale clouds, dissolving almost as soon as it formed. The garden gnomes, usually brazen, rude little things that popped up to chatter and swear and nip at ankles, were nowhere to be seen. Even the scrubby bushes along the path seemed to be holding still, the way everything in the world had held still in the moment after the battle ended and the shouting stopped. "It looks different," Ginny said quietly. Harry stared up at the crooked silhouette. Windows set at odd angles, the topmost room somehow defying gravity, the whole place stitched together by spells and stubbornness and love. He searched for what she meant, and found nothing that his eyes could name. Not really. It was still the burrow, lopsided, chaotic, alive in its own way. But she was right anyway. Not because the burrow had changed, because what it held had changed. Because one laugh was missing from inside those walls, one set of footsteps, one voice that had once filled every corner with mischief like sunlight. Ginny pushed the gate open. It gave its usual squeal, sharp in the silence. The sound seemed too loud, almost rude, as if the world had forgotten how to be gentle. Harry wished, irrationally, that it had stayed quiet. They walked up the path without speaking, their boots crunching over frost-hardened earth, the cold biting through leather and wool, the air tasting clean and thin. The door opened before they could knock. Molly Weasley stood in the doorway, framed by heat and light. For a moment, Harry couldn't move. Not because he didn't know how, but because the sight of her hit him in a place he hadn't braced, somewhere deep and tender. She looked smaller, not shorter exactly, but worn down. The comfortable roundness that had always made her feel like warmth made visible had faded from her cheeks. There were shadows beneath her eyes that no amount of rest seemed capable of filling. And yet when she saw them, her face lifted into a smile that tried so hard to be the same as always. "Oh, Harry." Ginny, love. Her voice was still Molly's, brisk and warm and full of care. But there was something underneath it now, a faint brittleness, like ice stretched over dark water. She stepped forward and wrapped them both in a hug that was fierce enough to make Harry's ribs ache. It was the kind of embrace that didn't ask permission, that didn't allow room for distance or politeness. It said, "You are mine, and you are safe here. And if the world has taken too much, then I will hold you tighter." "You must be freezing," she said, pulling back to inspect them as if she could scold the cold away. Come in, come in." The kitchen met them like a wave. Heat rolled out, thick and overwhelming, as if Molly had decided the only acceptable answer to winter was to burn it into retreat. Every burner on the stove was occupied by a pot or pan, steam rising in clouds so dense the windows wept with condensation. The long wooden table was covered, absolutely covered, in food. Pies and pastries, roasts and casseroles, bread piled beside bread, bowls of vegetables glistening as if they'd been polished. It looked like a feast meant for an army. Harry's stomach tightened, not with hunger, but with something else, an ache he couldn't swallow down. Molly was already moving again, back to the stove, wand flicking, stirring 3 pots at once, as though the motion itself kept her upright. "I've made your favorites, Harry," she said, too quickly. "Treacle tart and cottage pie, and I thought perhaps some of that chicken you like. And there's mince pies. And I put extra butter in the mash because Arthur says, well, never mind what Arthur says. Sit down, dears. You'll want something warm. Mom, Ginny said softly, stepping closer, voice gentler than Harry had ever heard it when she was addressing her mother. We're not hungry just yet. Molly didn't turn around. Her shoulders tensed, as if the words had struck something in her that she didn't want touched. Of course not, she said, bright and brittle. Of course. But it'll be ready when you are. Of course. Always ready. Always ready. Harry's throat tightened. He looked at Ginny, and she looked back, her face carefully calm, but her eyes carrying the same worry that had been following them since they'd decided to come here for Christmas. Upstairs, somewhere, the house creaked, a settling sound. For a second, Harry imagined he heard the patter of twin feet running, someone calling out a joke, the familiar sound of laughter launching itself down the staircase like a spell. But there was only the hiss of steam and the clink of Molly's spoon against metal. I'll take the bags up, Harry said, because he needed something to do, because he needed to move. Good boy, Molly said automatically, still not turning. Ron and Hermione are upstairs. Arthur's in the shed. Bill's coming tomorrow. Charlie, too. Percy, if he can manage. George is... Her wand slowed mid-stir. George is in his room, she finished, voice going faint. Harry climbed the stairs slowly, as if speed might disturb whatever fragile balance the burrow had found. The walls were lined with photographs, moving as they always had. The Weasley family waving, grinning, pulling faces. A picture of Bill and Fleur's wedding caught his eye. Everyone was dressed in their best, laughing. Fred and George were there, arms around each other, identical smiles, two bright flames side by side. Harry looked away quickly as if the sight might burn him. Ron's voice drifted from behind his bedroom door, low and murmuring, and Hermione's quieter reply. Their conversation stopped the moment Harry knocked. It's me, he said. The door yanked open, and Ron hauled him into a hug that was rough and urgent, the kind that had too much meaning pressed into it. Harry hugged back just as tightly. When they pulled apart, Ron's face looked older than it had any right to look. Lines of exhaustion and grief carved in around his eyes. Hermione was sitting on the bed with a book open in her lap. It was obviously for comfort, not reading. Her finger marked a place she hadn't reached in a long time. How is it? Harry asked quietly. Ron shrugged, but the movement seemed heavy, as if his shoulders carried stones. Mom cooks, he said, all the time, like constantly. Dad's in the shed more than he's in the house. And George... He stopped. His mouth tightened, and his eyes flicked away. Hermione picked up where Ron couldn't, her voice gentle but firm, as if she were naming something that needed to be named. He doesn't come down for meals, she said. He barely speaks. Mostly he stays in his room. Has anyone tried? Harry asked, though he knew the answer. Everyone, Ron said, a sharp edge creeping in. And when I say everyone, I mean Mum's tried enough for all of us. She keeps taking plates up there. He doesn't touch them. Or he does, maybe. But he doesn't open the door. We can hear him pacing sometimes, back and forth, like he's wearing a path into the floor. Grief isn't something you can fix, Hermione said softly, watching Harry as if she could see the thought forming behind his eyes. And you, Harry, you always want to fix things. You always think if you can just do the right thing, say the right words, it'll change. Harry swallowed. He thought of the war, of all the impossible things he'd done, the spells and courage and sheer desperate stubbornness that had carried them through. He thought, foolishly, that after Voldemort, after darkness itself, Surely he should be able to do something about this. Surely there should be some spell to stitch a family back together after the world ripped it apart. But he knew better. The silence stretched between them, full of what they were all learning not to say aloud. Well, Ron said finally, forcing brightness like a poorly cast charm, at least you're here, both of you. That helps. Harry nodded, because it was easier than arguing. Dinner was wrong. Not wrong in the way the food tasted. Molly's cooking was still Molly's cooking. Rich and perfect and comforting in a way nothing else in the wizarding world ever managed. But the table had been set for 8. Harry counted twice, as if his eyes might have misread the number of plates. 8. The empty chair sat there like an accusation, like a bruise no one could stop pressing. Molly ladled food onto the plate in front of it. Automatically, her movements practiced, as if her hand still believed that any moment Fred might charge into the kitchen, grin wide, snatch something off the table, and make a joke about everyone looking miserable. Arthur's hand reached out and, gently, wordlessly slid the plate away. He didn't say a thing. He didn't need to. Molly stared at the spot where the plate had been for half a second too long, then turned back to the stove, as if the act of cooking could cover what had happened. Conversation came in short bursts that died quickly. "How's the office?" Ginny asked Arthur, trying. Arthur looked up from his potatoes with a startled expression, as though he had forgotten he was expected to speak. "Oh, yes, fine," he said. "Perkins retired last month, gave me his entire collection of spark plugs. Fascinating things, spark plugs. The way they create the spark from compression and—" He stopped abruptly, cheeks flushing as if he'd done something wrong by talking too much. Ron cleared his throat. "Hermione and I went to Diagon Alley last week. It's busier. Shops reopening." "That's good," Harry said. "That's really good." It felt like they were all reading from scripts someone had written years ago, performing normal for each other's benefit. Molly kept glancing at the ceiling, as though she could see through flaws, as though her eyes could reach George's door. Twice she shifted in her seat as if to stand, as if to fetch him a plate, as if she might physically drag him down to the table and force life to be what it had been. Twice Arthur's hand rested on her arm. A quiet stop. When dinner finally ended, everyone scattered as quickly as though staying in the room too long might make the truth heavier. Ron and Hermione went upstairs with murmured goodnights. Arthur muttered something about the chickens, then disappeared into the darkness outside. Molly began washing dishes with sharp, aggressive motions that made the plates clatter. She didn't use magic. She didn't let the plates float and rinse themselves. She scrubbed like she could scrub grief off porcelain. Harry drifted into the sitting room and sat on the threadbare sofa that had held him through so many evenings. It was the same sofa where he'd once watched Fred and George demonstrate joke products for Ron until Molly chased them off with her wand. The same sofa where Hermione had fallen asleep mid-argument, book slipping to the floor. The same sofa where Ginny had curled close to him, her shoulder warm against his. Now the room felt bigger. The corners felt farther away. The burrow creaked and settled around him, but the sounds weren't cozy tonight. They were lonely. Ginny appeared in the doorway wearing one of Molly's old cardigans, sleeves too long. "Walk?" she asked. He nodded. Outside, the cold air felt like a blessing after the suffocating heat of the kitchen. The sky had cleared just enough to show scattered stars pricked through darkness like tiny holes of light. Snow began to fall, soft, silent flakes that landed on Ginny's hair and melted into damp shine. From the shed came a faint orange glow and the occasional clang of metal. "Dad's been spending a lot of time out there," Ginny said quietly. I think it's easier for him than being in the house. Hidden by Hypna. Harry understood. The shed was a place for fixing, a place where broken things could be taken apart and put back together, or at least made sense of. The kitchen, in contrast, was full of things that could not be fixed. They walked along familiar paths in the garden, their feet finding the way even in the dark. Harry had been coming here for years. He knew the burrow almost as well as Hogwarts. Maybe better, because Hogwarts had been a school and a battlefield, while this had been home, the only real home he'd had. "Do you think it'll get better?" he asked eventually. Ginny didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was careful, as if she were choosing words that wouldn't snap. "I think it'll get different," she said. "I don't know if that's the same as better." Harry watched the snow drifting down. He thought of other winters, snowball fights on the Hogwarts grounds, building forts with Ron and Hermione, Fred and George enchanting snowmen to sing insults at passers-by. He could almost hear the laughter. He pushed it away because it hurt. They went back inside to find the kitchen still lit. Molly stood at the sink washing dishes by hand, despite the fact that she could have had them clean themselves with a flick of her wand. "Mom," Ginny said softly, stepping closer. "You should rest." "Just finishing up, dear," Molly replied without turning. "Go on to bed." "You must be tired." But her hands kept moving in endless circles, scrubbing plates that were already spotless. Like if she stopped, the quiet would catch her. Like if she stopped, she might fall. Later, in Ginny's room, Harry lay awake listening to the burrow breathe. The house had always had its own sounds: pipes, floorboards, faint creaks as it shifted under the weight of itself. So first you care. Tonight, those sounds seemed to carry meaning. From somewhere above came footsteps, back and forth, back and forth. George pacing. It had been going on so long it felt like the rhythm of a heartbeat. Harry's chest ached with it. Ginny was curled against him, warm and tense. Her breathing told him she wasn't asleep either. "Tell me something good," she whispered into the dark. "Something that has nothing to do with this." Harry thought for a moment, searching for something harmless, small, normal. "The Chudley Cannons signed a new seeker," he said finally. Ron's beside himself. Ginny's breath hitched, and he felt her smile against his shoulder. "That is good," she murmured. Ron deserves something to be excited about. The footsteps above continued, back and forth, until suddenly they stopped. The silence that followed felt even louder. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft enough to make the world look clean, like it could start over. But Harry knew that in the morning the snow would melt or be trampled, and underneath the ground would be the same. Some things magic couldn't fix. Some things time didn't erase. Ginny's breathing finally deepened into sleep. Harry lay awake a little longer, listening to the quiet, thinking of Molly cooking enough food for an army, Arthur hiding in his shed, George pacing above them, a family trying desperately to learn how to be a family again with one piece missing. At last he drifted. Harry woke to the smell of bacon and bread and something sweet that tugged at a half-memory. The light through Ginny's window was grey and thin, barely dawn. Voices and clattering from downstairs suggested the kitchen had been active for hours. Ginny blinked awake beside him, eyes heavy. "She's at it again," she murmured. They dressed in silence and went downstairs. The kitchen looked impossibly even more crowded with food than the night before. The table groaned beneath pastries, eggs in multiple forms, sausages, bacon, kippers, porridge, jam, toast, and Harry's eyebrows rose, what appeared to be an entire glazed ham. Molly stood at the stove, one directing pans like an orchestra conductor, while her hands kneaded dough as if she were trying to press something out of it. "Morning, dears," she said without turning. "Breakfast is almost ready. I made pancakes, but I thought maybe you'd prefer French toast, so I made that too. And there's porridge with cream and honey. Fred always liked extra honey in his porridge, said it made him faster on his broom, though I told him that was nonsense." Her hands stilled in the dough. For a moment she stood frozen, like the words had pulled her somewhere she didn't want to go. Then she began kneading again, harder, movements almost violent. Harry met Ginny's eyes and made a small gesture towards the stove. "Distract her." Ginny nodded. "Mum," she said gently, "why don't you sit down? Let us help." "Don't be silly," Molly replied too quickly. "Your guests." "Mom," Ginny said, stepping closer, voice firm beneath the gentleness. "I live here, and Harry's family." Molly didn't seem to hear her. She moved on to cracking eggs. So many eggs, whisking with such intensity that some sloshed over the bowl. Harry approached slowly, like someone nearing a frightened animal. "Mrs. Weasley," he said, keeping his voice light. "I could really use your help. I never learned how to make proper bacon. I always burn it. Will you show me?" It was obvious. They both knew it was a tactic, but Molly's movements slowed. "Oh," she said, almost reflexive. "Well, you just watch the heat, dear. Keep it steady. Not too high." Harry picked up the spatula and deliberately angled it wrong. "No, no," Molly said, stepping in. "Here, like this. You turn it gently. See? Let it cook evenly." Her hands steadied as she focused. The frantic energy that had been buzzing around her softened just a little, as if teaching was a rope she could hold. While Molly's attention was on the bacon, Ginny quietly began vanishing excess dishes back into cupboards with subtle flicks of her wand, removing food the way you might remove sharp objects from someone in distress, carefully, without making it obvious. When Molly turned at last, the table looked abundant rather than alarming. Molly blinked, noticing. "Oh," she said softly. Then, more firmly, as if she could scold a moment into normal, "Well, that's more sensible. Can't let food go to waste." The garden door creaked open, and Arthur stepped in. His boots were muddy. His hair stood on end, and purple shadows lay beneath his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. "Morning, Molly Wobbles," he said, forcing cheerfulness the way Ron had tried the night before. "Smells wonderful." "Arthur Weasley," Molly snapped, worry disguised as irritation. "You've been in that shed all night. You'll catch your death. Just fixing up the old wireless," Arthur said quickly. "The one from your father's. Thought I nearly had it when the sun came up. Decided to see it through." He washed his hands at the sink. Movements automatic. "Any chance of breakfast?" "Sit," Molly said. Immediately, "Sit down. Harry's helping with the bacon." Ron and Hermione appeared next, hair rumpled with sleep. Bill arrived soon after, looking tired and scarred and steady in the way Bill always had been. He kissed Molly's cheek and managed a genuine smile at the spread. "Blimey, ma'am," he said. "Expecting the whole Holyhead Harpies team?" "Just making sure there's enough," Molly replied, defensive note creeping in. "There's always enough," Bill said softly, and pressed her hand once. Just a brief touch, but full of meaning. They ate in relative quiet. The silence was broken by small requests and careful compliments. Molly barely touched her own plate. She watched everyone else eat, refilling before anyone had finished, as if the sight of food disappearing into mouths proved something she desperately needed proven. I can still feed my family. I can still keep them here. Harry noticed again that she had set 8 places. The empty chair remained. Halfway through breakfast, Molly stood abruptly. "I should take a plate up to George," she said. "He needs to eat. He's getting too thin." Arthur's hand caught hers. "Gentle but firm. Let him be, Molly. He needs to eat, Arthur. He'll come down when he's ready." "And if he's not ready," Molly said, voice cracking. "If he's never ready." Her breath hitched. The words came out sharp, raw. "I've already lost one son," she whispered. "I won't watch another waste away." Silence dropped like a curtain. Arthur stood and wrapped his arms around her. Molly collapsed against him, shoulders shaking with sobs she tried to keep silent. Harry stared at his plate, feeling like an intruder in something sacred and broken. Ginny's hand found his under the table and squeezed hard. "I'm sorry," Molly whispered eventually, pulling away, wiping her cheeks with her apron. "I'm sorry, that was—" "Don't apologize, Mum," Bill said, voice firm. "Not for that. Not ever," Molly nodded, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "There's laundry," she said quickly, escaping into tasks. "And I need to start on lunch. I thought perhaps a roast—" "Mum," Ginny said, standing, crossing to her. "Sit down, please. Have tea." For a moment, it looked like Molly might refuse out of habit, out of pride, out of fear. Then slowly, she sank into her chair. Ginny poured tea exactly the way Molly liked it. Milk, sugar, a careful stir, like she was performing a spell of comfort that she'd learned by watching her mother do it for others all her life. Hermione began gathering plates. Ron stood too, surprising everyone with how gentle he was. "I'll dry," he said. Harry joined them at the sink, and soon they formed a quiet rhythm. Wash, dry, stack, put away. Mundane work. Ordinary work. Work with an ending. There was something soothing about it, something that didn't ask you to solve the unsolvable. At the table, Arthur kept up a stream of quiet conversation aimed at Molly. Nothing important, nothing that could crack open grief again. The weather. The chickens. A silly memo at work. Bill added small comments. Ginny stayed beside her mother, one hand resting on Molly's arm. Slowly, so slowly Harry almost didn't believe it, tension eased. And then came the sound they'd all been waiting for without admitting it. Footsteps on the stairs. Everyone froze. George appeared in the doorway. Harry's breath caught. He looked terrible, pale, hollow-eyed, his hair unwashed, sticking up in odd angles. His clothes hung loosely on a frame that had always been lanky, but now seemed diminished, like grief had eaten away at him from the inside. But it was his eyes that hit Harry hardest. They were flat, not angry, not even properly sad, just extinguished, like someone had snuffed out a candle that had always burned. "George," Molly breathed, half rising. "Morning," George said. His voice sounded like it hadn't been used much, rough with disuse. He looked past them all, as if seeing the room from far away. "Any breakfast left?" The question was so ordinary that it stunned the room into stillness. Molly moved first, instinct snapping her into motion like it always did. "Of course, love," she said too fast. "Of course. Sit. Sit down. I'll fix you something." George sat in his usual chair, not the empty one, not Fred's, his own. He stared at the table. Harry noticed his hand drift unconsciously toward the empty space beside him, then jerk back as if burned. Molly placed a plate in front of him piled high. George looked at it with something close to dismay. "Mum," he said quietly, "I can't eat all this." "Just what you can," Molly said. Her voice softened, a plea disguised as permission. "That's all. Just what you can." Bah! George picked up his fork. The simple act seemed to exhaust him. He took a bite, chewed, swallowed. Another bite. Everyone pretended not to watch. Ron broke the spell by sitting down across from George, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Cannon signed a new seeker," he said conversationally. George's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but something. "They sign a new seeker every year," he said, voice dry. "Still come in last." "Yeah, well," Ron said stubbornly, "maybe this one's magic." George's gaze flicked up, almost amused, despite himself. "They're all magic, Ron," he said. "We're wizards." Harry felt something in the room shift, tiny, almost imperceptible, like a door opening the smallest crack. Hermione joined them, carefully casual. "We were thinking of going into the village later," she said. The shop's meant to have new self-spelling quills. "Waste of money," George muttered. There was a hint of the old derision in his tone, and that tiny, familiar sharpness made Harry's throat ache. Ron brightened. "That's what I said." But Hermione... "I do not insist," Hermione said firmly. I suggested, "For someone whose handwriting is..." "Illustrious," Ron interrupted. "Illegible," Hermione corrected. George took another bite, then another. He managed about a third of the plate before pushing it away. "Can't manage more." "That's fine," Molly said quickly. "That's just fine." She vanished the plate with a flick, relief trembling through her, like she'd been holding her breath for days. George stood. Everyone tensed, waiting to see if he would disappear back upstairs. Instead, he moved to the window and stared out at the snow-dusted garden. "It snowed," he said quietly. "Last night," Arthur replied. "Quite beautiful, actually. Covered everything in white." George's voice stayed flat, matter-of-fact. Fred loved snow. No one knew what to say. George turned away from the window. "I'm going back upstairs," he said.
"But thanks for breakfast, Mum. Any time, love," Molly whispered.
"Any time at all." George left. His footsteps on the stairs were heavy, but real. A door closed above. Then the burrow settled again into its waiting quiet. Molly sank into her chair, like her bones had turned to water. "He came down," she said, voice trembling. "Arthur, he came down. He did," Arthur said softly, and Harry saw his eyes shining. "That's something, Molly. That's really something." Bill stood, stretching, as if he needed to move before grief crept back in. "Right," he said. "I'm going to check the wards around the property. Make sure everything's secure." "I'll help," Harry said quickly, grateful for something practical. Something outside, something that didn't taste like steam and tears. They pulled on coats and stepped into the cold. Snow crunched underfoot. Their breath rose and vanished. Harry waited until they were far enough from the kitchen windows that Molly couldn't see them. "He looked awful," Harry said quietly. Bill nodded. eyes on the perimeter as he walked. "He's grieving," he said simply. "There's no good way to look when you're grieving." They moved along the edge of the property, while Bill checked the wards with his wand, pauses punctuating the walk like commas. Everything was secure, as it always had been, as it always would be. That wasn't the point. The point was air that didn't carry tension. The point was distance from the kitchen where Molly could cook herself into collapse. "How's Fleur?" Harry asked after a while. Bill's mouth softened. "Worried," he admitted. "About all of us. She wanted to come earlier." "I thought it might be better to give Mum time before adding more people." "Probably wise," Harry said. They completed the circuit and stopped, looking back at the burrow. Against the grey sky, it looked both fragile and stubborn, like it shouldn't still be standing, and yet somehow was. "It'll get better," Bill said, but his voice didn't sound sure. "It has to." Harry wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe that one day Molly would cook normal amounts of food again, that Arthur would sit in the living room instead of hiding in the shed, that George would laugh with his whole face, but standing in the snow, looking at the house full of pain. Harry found himself wondering if better was the right word, or if all they could hope for was bearable. Through the kitchen window he saw Molly moving again, stirring, chopping, creating meals, like spells, and, slipping out the back door, Arthur heading toward his shed. The world kept turning, whether they were ready or not. That afternoon, Harry found himself in Arthur's shed. Officially, it was to help with the stubborn toaster Arthur had dragged home from some muggle sale or bin or ministry confiscation. In reality, Harry suspected they were both simply seeking refuge. The shed was cluttered in a way Harry found oddly comforting. Shelves were packed with muggle objects in various stages of disassembly, wires like tangled vines, screws in jars, bits of metal laid out like bones. Tools hung from nails. Diagrams and notes were pinned to every available surface. A small pot-bellied stove radiated warmth, and weak winter sunlight filtered through the grimy window. Arthur sat hunched over a workbench, unscrewing the toaster with intense concentration. His hands were steady. His focus was absolute. Harry recognized it for what it was. The same desperate need for control that drove Molly to cook. The same urge to fix something, anything, because the thing that was truly broken was beyond repair. "Fascinating mechanism, really," Arthur murmured, more to himself than Harry. "Electrical resistance, you see. Produces heat. Brilliant in its simplicity. No magic at all, just engineering." Harry picked up a screwdriver and turned it over in his hand. "What can I do?" he asked. Arthur blinked as if he'd forgotten Harry was there, then gestured to a battered box by Harry's foot. "If you could sort through that, organize the screws by size. Very helpful." Busy work. They both knew it. Harry sat on an overturned crate and began sorting. The task required enough attention to keep his mind from spiraling, but not so much that he couldn't let thoughts drift. The stove popped softly. Outside, snow fell again, quiet as ash. They worked in silence for a long time. Then Arthur spoke suddenly, voice low. "Fred used to come out here," he said. "Sometimes George, too. When they were younger, before everything became the shop." Harry's hands paused over the screws. Arthur continued, eyes on the toaster but gaze somewhere far away. "They'd help me with projects. Well, help might be generous. Mostly, they tried to make things explode, or turn purple, or grow legs." A small smile flickered across his mouth. "There and gone like a ghost. One summer, Arthur said softly, they decided they could make a Muggle television work with magic. Spent weeks on it, absolutely convinced they could do it. It finally turned on, played 3 seconds of something, then melted into a puddle of plastic and wires. Harry smiled, despite the tightness in his throat. What did Molly say? Arthur let out a quiet, rusty chuckle, as if laughter was a tool he hadn't used in a long time. Molly was furious, he said. The smell was terrible, stained the floor. But Fred and George, they were delighted. Claimed it had been their plan all along. Said they'd invented self-destructing entertainment. Tried to sell the concept to their brothers for 2 sickles. Did anyone buy it? Harry asked. Ron nearly did, Arthur said, and the smile flickered again. Ginny talked him out of it. Arthur's hands stilled. His gaze dropped to the open toaster, to the wires and metal. Fred was always like that, he said quietly. Could turn anything into a joke. Find humor in disaster. He swallowed. George, too, of course. But Fred, his voice faltered. Fred was always the one who laughed first. George would wait just a half second to see Fred's reaction before joining in. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Arthur set down his tools. I keep expecting him to walk through the door, he said, voice rough. Every time I hear footsteps. Every time someone laughs. I expect it to be him. He drew a shaky breath. And then I remember. His shoulders sagged. It's like losing him all over again, he whispered. Every single time. Harry didn't know what words could possibly fit. He'd lost people too. Sirius, Dumbledore, Hedwig, Remus, Tonks. And he knew that grief didn't end. It changed shape. It learned to sit in the corners of your life and wait. He'd be proud of you, Harry said finally. Fred, for what you did, for how you kept going. Arthur shook his head slowly. I didn't keep anything together, he said, guilt spilling out like something he'd been holding back for months. I hid at the ministry. Pretended everything was fine while my children fought, while they... His voice cracked. I should have protected him, he whispered. All of them. That's what fathers do, isn't it? Protect their children. Arthur, Harry said softly. Arthur looked up. Really looked. And Harry saw exhaustion there. Bone deep, soul deep, and something like shame. You couldn't have stopped him, Harry said. Any of them. They fought because it was right. Because you and Mrs. Weasley raised them to stand up for what's right. He searched for words that wouldn't sound like hollow comfort. That's not failure, Harry said. That's the best kind of parenting there is. Arthur stared for a moment, then exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath for years. You sound very wise, he said hoarsely. For someone so young. Harry's mouth tightened, half a smile. I've had good teachers, he said. They went back to work. The toaster didn't suddenly become less stubborn, but something between them had shifted. An honesty, a shared recognition that pain didn't need hiding in this shed full of broken things. The door burst open and Ron stomped in, snow on his boots and cheeks red from cold. Mom sent me to tell you lunch is ready, he announced, then grimaced. But honestly, I think I'm hiding too. Arthur huffed a laugh. Ron looked around with genuine interest. What are you working on? Toaster, Arthur said. Brilliant, Ron said. Mind if I stay? Promise I'll be useful. Since when? Harry teased. Ron grinned. I'm excellent at handing people tools. Very advanced skill. Arthur gestured to another crate. Sit, then. Stay as long as you like. And so the shed filled slowly with voices, safer topics, everyday things. Quidditch, Ron's oral training. Hermione's work. Conversations that weren't about death, weren't about holes in families. Bill joined later. Then Charlie arrived, with Snow still clinging to his dragonhide jacket, bursting in with his usual energy. Heard there was a Weasley gathering, Charlie boomed, clapping Harry on the shoulder. Couldn't miss that. Arthur's face lit up in a way Harry hadn't seen since they arrived. Charlie, Arthur said, genuinely delighted. We weren't expecting you until tomorrow. Managed to get away early, Charlie said. Molly about to feed everyone to death, I assume?
You assume correctly.
Bill said dryly. The shed became crowded with the low rumble of male voices, talk and occasional laughter. Someone produced a bottle of fire whiskey. Charlie, obviously, and it made the rounds. Stories began to surface like treasures pulled from the bottom of a lake. Remember the time Fred and George convinced Percy he'd been made head boy? Charlie said. Ron snorted. They had a fake letter and everything. Percy strutted around for 2 days, being insufferable. More insufferable, Bill corrected. Arthur's eyes crinkled. Merlin, Percy's face when he found out. He tried to hex them, Ron said. They anticipated it, Bill said, amused. Every hex bounced off and hit Percy instead. Turned him purple for a week, Arthur added. Purple with little yellow spots, Ron said, laughing. Like an exotic fruit. The stories flowed easier then. One memory pulled another. The prefect badges that had been charmed to sing. The ghoul in the attic turned into Father Christmas, with reindeer that terrorized the chickens. The countless pranks, the small moments and big ones that made up a life. Harry listened, warmth spreading through him, sorrow sitting beside it, like a familiar companion. He realized they were doing something important, keeping Fred alive in words. Then, unexpectedly, Harry heard his own voice. He saved my life once, he said. Everyone turned toward him. At the ministry, Harry continued, surprised by how steady his voice was. 5th year, a Death Eater had me cornered. And Fred, he came out of nowhere with this jinx that made the bloke's robes attack him. Wrapped around his head. Completely ridiculous. Arthur smiled, soft and proud. Fred winked at me. Harry said and said, You're welcome, Harry Potter, sir, in this ridiculous voice, and then he ran off to help George with something else. That sounds like him, Arthur murmured. He made everything lighter, Harry said, even when it was terrible, even when we were scared. He could always find joy. Arthur's gaze went distant. That's Molly's side, he said quietly. Her brothers were like that too, Fabian and Gideon. Could find humor anywhere. Fought to the end. Probably died laughing at something. The bottle made another round. I miss him, Ron said suddenly, voice thick. Every day. Every bloody day. Arthur's hand rested on Ron's shoulder. We all do, son, he said. We all do. The silence that followed was different now. Not a silence full of things unsaid. A silence full of shared understanding. Eventually, Charlie stood and stretched. Come on, he said. We should head back before Molly sends a search party. Or worse, brings dinner out here. They filed out into the cold night, breath misting. The burrow glowed with warm light in its windows. Before going inside, Arthur led them into the back garden, away from the house lights. The sky had cleared. Stars spilled across the dark like scattered salt. "We used to do this when they were boys," Arthur said softly. "Bring them out to look at the stars." Charlie's voice gentled. "Fred always wanted to know if wizards had been to the moon," he said. Said he and George were going to be the first magical astronauts. They stood in a loose circle in the cold, staring up at the endless dark. A light came on in an upstairs window, George's room. Harry's breath caught again. A silhouette stood there, unmoving, looking out. Arthur saw it. His hand lifted in a small wave, as if the gesture could reach through glass and grief. The silhouette didn't move. They waited, all of them, hoping for a sign. A wave back, a flicker, anything that said George knew he wasn't alone. After a long moment, the light went out. The window went dark. Ron shifted, voice uncertain. "Should we?" "No," Arthur said firmly. "We let him be. When he's ready, he'll come out. Forcing it won't help." They stood a moment longer, cold, seeping through coats, then turned toward the burrow. At the door, Charlie caught Harry's arm. "Thanks," he said quietly, "for being here." Harry met his eyes. "I'm family," he said, and the words felt true down to the bone. Charlie nodded. "Yeah, you are." Inside, the kitchen waited. Molly had dinner ready, smaller portions this time, Harry noticed with a quiet surge of relief. They ate. They talked a little. The house felt less like a wound and more like a place that could still hold them. Later, in bed, Ginny curled against Harry and whispered, "Dad talked about Fred today, didn't he?" Harry nodded in the dark. He did. Real stories. "That's good," Ginny murmured. "That's really good." Outside, the stars wheeled on, indifferent and eternal. The burrow creaked and settled around them. And somewhere upstairs, George lay awake, perhaps thinking of twins and stars and all the things that came in pairs until they didn't. Morning arrived in the burrow the way it often did, without ceremony, without warning, simply sliding into the house, through frosted windows, and settling over everything, like a thin sheet. Harry woke to muffled movement downstairs, the clink of a kettle, the soft scrape of a chair, the low murmur of voices that sounded carefully controlled. The kind of voices people used when they didn't want to wake the sleeping, or when they were afraid that speaking too loudly might knock something fragile off balance. Ginny lay beside him, staring at the ceiling. "First Christmas without him," she said very quietly, as if saying it out loud might make it real in a way it had managed not to be until now. Harry's throat tightened. He didn't pretend not to understand who she meant. The burrow had always been full of laughter at Christmas, loud and ridiculous, and spilling out of rooms like light. Fred and George had treated the holiday like a personal challenge. How much chaos could they produce in one day without Molly hexing them into next week? Now, there was a space where that mischief should have been. A silence shaped exactly like a twin. "Yeah," Harry said softly. "It feels wrong." Ginny let out a slow breath. "It does. But we're here anyway." "We're here anyway." They lay still for another moment, gathering courage the way people gathered blankets against the cold. Then they dressed and went downstairs. The first thing Harry noticed was that the house felt warmer than it should have at this hour. Someone had been up early stoking fires. Someone had decided that the cold outside would not be allowed inside. The second thing he noticed was that the kitchen table had already been set with tea and toast, and Molly's movements, though still brisk, weren't frantic. Not yet. Arthur sat at the table with a cup of tea in his hands, staring into it as if it might contain answers. Half awake. Hair sticking up. Hair sticking up. Hermione sat with her back straight, hands around her mug, eyes alert in the way they always were when she sensed something unspoken hanging in the air. And Percy Weasley sat among them like a man who had walked into the wrong room by accident. His robes were immaculate, as though he'd pressed them with a spell until every crease obeyed. His hair was combed into order. His posture was formal enough that he looked as if he might stand and announce a ministry memo at any moment. But his eyes were tired. Not just sleepy tired. The kind of tired that came from lying awake for too many nights, with the same thoughts, circling like vultures. The kind of tired Harry had seen in mirrors. Percy rose the moment he saw Harry and Ginny moving too fast, as if he was afraid he'd miss his chance to do it correctly. "Harry," he said, and his voice was careful, measured. "Ginny, it's good to see you both." He extended his hand toward Ginny. Ginny ignored it completely and hugged him instead, quick and fierce, the way Molly hugged people, like she was trying to hold him in place so the world couldn't pull him away again. Percy froze at first, then, awkwardly, like someone relearning a language, he wrapped his arms around her.
Glad you're here, Percy, Ginny said, pulling back.
"Yes," Percy replied, clearing his throat. "Well, I thought, with Christmas approaching, it seemed appropriate to be here," Molly interrupted gently, and for the first time that morning her smile looked real. Fragile, but real. It seemed very appropriate. Percy's ears turned red. Arthur lifted his mug in a small salute. "Good to have you home, son." Something in Percy's face softened, just a fraction, as if those simple words loosened a knot he'd been carrying for years. Molly, emboldened by the fact that one more child had walked through the door, set her cup down decisively. "Right," she announced, voice brightening with determination. "We're decorating today." The room went still. Christmas decorating at the Burrow was not a quiet activity. It was not a gentle, tasteful placement of ornaments. It was a family battle disguised as tradition. It was tangled lights and enchanted garlands, and Fred and George testing how far they could push before Molly snapped. It was laughter in the rafters. The idea of doing it now, with the hole in the middle of them, made something tighten in Harry's chest. Molly's brightness faltered for half a second. "The house needs Christmas," she said, a little more softly. "I think it helps. Makes everything feel more." Her words drifted off into the space where the truth sat. Arthur supplied it carefully, like placing something delicate on a table. "Festive," he said. Molly nodded quickly. "Yes, festive." Hermione stood, as if she could sense that if no one moved now, the moment would collapse. "I think that's a lovely idea, Mrs. Weasley," she said firmly. "We'd love to help." "Absolutely," Bill said, appearing in the doorway as if summoned by the word help. Snow dusted his shoulders, and his hair was still damp from cold air. "Where do you keep the boxes?" "Attic," Arthur said. "I'll show you." Within the hour, the sitting room was full of crates and battered boxes, their lids shoved open, spilling decorations across every surface. Some were store-bought, twinkling lights, shiny baubles, but most were handmade, paper stars with uneven points. Garlands of dried orange slices and cinnamon sticks, ornaments shaped like tiny dragons or silly little gnomes. knitted scarves meant for the tree that looked like they'd been made by children. Harry picked up a crooked star made from bent wire, charmed to glow softly. On the back, in childish handwriting, was a name. Ginny. Ginny leaned over his shoulder and smiled faintly. Made that when I was 6. Harry turned it over carefully, as if it might break. She kept it. Ginny's smile grew sadder. She keeps everything. Of course I do, Molly called, overhearing. Her voice softened. You're my children. Everything you ever make is precious. She lifted a string of enchanted lights and checked each bulb, as if she were inspecting them for flaws. Harry noticed her hands trembled slightly. She hid it well, but not perfectly. And then he noticed where her gaze kept drifting. To a box in the corner. One box no one had touched. Its lid was shut, and someone, Molly perhaps, had wrapped a strip of cloth around it like a bandage. It sat apart from the others, waiting. Ron noticed too, because Ron noticed the things that mattered even when he pretended he didn't. What's in that one, Mum? He asked, voice casual. Molly's hands stilled. Oh, she said too quickly. Just some things Fred and George made over the years. Very... The room tightened around the name. I thought perhaps we might not, Molly continued, voice wavering. Maybe this year we could leave that box. Just for... A voice came from the doorway. We should use them. Everyone froze. George stood at the entrance to the sitting room. He looked a little better than yesterday. Washed, at least. Though his skin still carried that pallor of someone whose body had forgotten how to rest. His eyes were still shadowed, but they were sharper now, more present. He wasn't smiling, but he was there. Molly made a sound that might have been a gasp. George, she breathed, as if she couldn't quite believe him. George didn't look at her right away. His gaze stayed fixed on the box in the corner. I want to use them, he said again, more quietly. Fred would be furious if we didn't. He spent weeks on some of that stuff. Molly took a step forward, torn between rushing to him and giving him space. You don't have to, she whispered. You really don't. George's jaw tightened. I want to... He crossed the room slowly, as if he were walking through water, and knelt beside the box. His hands hovered over the lid. For a moment, Harry thought he might change his mind. Thought he might flinch away and flee upstairs. Then George unwrapped the cloth and lifted the lid. Inside were decorations unlike any Harry had ever seen. Baubles that shifted color depending on the mood of the person holding them, garlands that sang in harmony, the notes soft and warm, tiny ornaments shaped like creatures that blinked and breathed little curls of fire. And tucked beneath layers of wrapped cloth were 7 white candles. George lifted them out with shaking hands, reverent as if he were handling relics. Fred's masterpiece, he said. Voice rough. Took him 3 years to get the enchantment right. Hermione stepped closer, eyes wide with curiosity and caution. What are they? George swallowed. Memory candles. The words seemed to hurt on the way out. When you light them, he continued, forcing himself through the explanation like someone reciting instructions to keep from drowning, they show your happiest memories. His voice cracked. He stopped, took a breath, tried again. He designed them for people who had lost someone, George said, eyes fixed on the candles, so they could remember the joy instead of the grief. The irony sat in the room like a weight. Molly's eyes filled immediately. I don't know if I can watch, she whispered. If I see him, if I see his memories, Then we watch together, Bill said, moving to her side. His voice was steady. All of us. Arthur stepped closer. George is right. George is right. Fred would want us to use them. George placed the 7 candles on the mantelpiece, aligning them carefully in a straight line. His hands lingered on the last one, fingertips resting against cool wax. Ron's voice came out quiet. How do they work? George exhaled. You light them, and you think of the person you want to see memories of. The candles show moments when that person was truly happy. Harry's chest tightened. Truly happy, as if happiness was a place you could visit if you knew the right spell. Arthur drew his wand. The others followed. Bill, Charlie, Percy, hesitant but present, Ron, Hermione, Ginny, and Harry. George stood closest, jaw clenched, wand tip trembling slightly. On 3, Arthur said, voice thick. Molly's hand rose to cover her mouth. 1, Arthur said. 2, 3, 7 wand tips lit. 7 flames touched 7 wicks. For a moment, nothing happened. Harry's heart pounded, the room holding its breath. Then the candle flame steadied and turned a shade of gold that didn't look like ordinary fire. The light rose above each flame, not harsh, not blinding, but soft and warm like bottled sunlight. It gathered itself into shapes and images. The first candle showed 2 small boys, no older than 7, chasing garden gnomes across the Burrow garden. Fred and George, identical faces, split by identical grins, shrieking with laughter. A toddler Ron stumbled after them, determined to be included. Baby Ginny clapped from Molly's arms. Molly made a noise that was half laugh, half sob. The second candle shifted to Hogwarts, the great hall during a feast. Percy, young and furious, stood beneath his prefect badge as it swooped and dove like a snitch. Fred's shoulders shook with silent laughter as he controlled it with his wand. George stood beside him, eyes bright, waiting that half-second before joining in. I remember that, Percy said, voice barely audible. I was furious. You gave them detention, Ron muttered, and somehow the fact that Ron could say it made it feel like a real memory, not just pain. Worth it, George whispered, eyes fixed on Fred's laughing face. Look how happy he is. The third candle showed the twins on broomsticks, flying in perfect synchronization. They moved like 2 halves of one mind, weaving patterns in the air that would have been impossible for anyone else. Their bodies leaned into turns at exactly the same moment, as if the wind itself belonged to them. Quidditch Cup, Ron breathed. The year you beat Slytherin. The best match Gryffindor ever played, Charlie added, sounding awed even now. The fourth candle showed Weasley's wizard wheezes in its chaotic glory. Fred stood behind the counter, demonstrating something that released purple smoke and the sound of trumpets. Customers applauded. Fred bowed dramatically, face lit with pride and mischief. He loved that shop, George said, voice thick. More than anything, he loved making people laugh. The fifth candle showed a moment Harry didn't recognize, and it hurt in a strange way, because it meant Fred had lived an entire life of moments outside Harry's view. Fred sat at the Burrow kitchen table helping a younger Ginny with homework. He pointed at parchment with exaggerated hand gestures, his face intensely serious in a way that was obviously fake. Ginny giggled, trying to concentrate. When she finally understood whatever he was explaining, her face lit up, and Fred's expression, pure delight at her success, was almost painful to witness. Ginny pressed a hand to her mouth. Tears slid down her cheeks silently. The sixth candle showed Bill and Fleur's wedding, Fred danced with Molly, spinning her around while she protested, laughing, telling him he was going too fast. Fred's joy radiated so strongly, it seemed to brighten the whole image. That was 3 days before, Molly whispered, voice breaking. Before everything. But look at him, Mum, Bill said, voice gentle but firm. Look how happy he was. The 7th candle showed the Battle of Hogwarts. Harry tensed instinctively, expecting blood and smoke. But it wasn't fighting. It was a lull. A corridor. Fred sat against the wall beside Percy. Both were dirty and exhausted. Fred's mouth moved, clearly making a joke. Percy tried not to smile. Failed. Fred reached over and ruffled Percy's hair, grinning like a child. Percy shoved him back, and they laughed. Actually laughed, right there, in the middle of war. Percy made a choked sound and turned away. That was an hour before, George whispered, voice hollow. An hour before the war.
Oh.
No one spoke after that. The images cycled again, looping through the 7 moments. Silent laughter filled the room. Shadows danced across walls. The burrow, for the first time since they'd arrived, looked almost like itself. Molly cried quietly, Arthur's arm around her. Bill shifted toward Percy, placing himself close enough that Percy wasn't alone with his shaking shoulders. Ron and Hermione stood hand in hand. Charlie stared at the candles with a mixture of wonder and devastation. And George stood frozen at the mantelpiece, watching his twins' happiness flicker in candlelight. Harry couldn't look at George's face for too long. The grief there was too huge, too raw, like staring into a storm. Eventually Molly spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said. George didn't answer. He only nodded once, stiffly, as if movement was all he could manage. He was so loved, Arthur said quietly, and he knew it. He looked at the images, at Fred laughing with Percy, dancing with Molly, beaming in the shop. That's what these show, Arthur said. Not just his happiness, but how much joy he found in all of you. Ron swallowed. Should we put them out? No, George said sharply, and for the first time in days his voice had force in it. Let them burn. He stared at the flames. That's what they're for, he said, softer now. To remember. To keep the happy parts alive. They continued decorating after that, slowly. Not with the frantic energy Christmas usually brought to the burrow, but with care. The candle images played on the mantel as a steady presence. Harry found himself beside Percy, hanging ornaments, while Percy worked with methodical precision. Percy's movements were too careful, too controlled, as if he thought any wrong placement might shatter the fragile piece. Percy spoke suddenly without looking at Harry. I should have been here more, he said, voice tight. Before, I wasted so much time being angry, being stubborn. He swallowed hard. And now, Harry didn't let Percy finish, because he knew where Percy's mind would go. Guilt like a poison, endless and self-feeding. He knew you loved him, Harry said firmly. That last memory. Percy, look at his face. He was happy to be beside you. Percy's mouth trembled. But those years... Don't, Harry said, softer now. Don't punish yourself with what you can't change. Fred wouldn't want that. Percy was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once, small and stiff, but real. As afternoon faded into evening, the sitting room transformed. Garlands draped across the mantel and staircase. Ornaments glittered. The crooked star Ginny had made as a child went on top of a small tree Charlie brought in, snow still clinging to its branches. The burrow smelled like pine and spice and whatever Molly was baking, something warm, something that felt like a hand on your shoulder. Molly called a halt eventually, voice tired but satisfied. "That's enough for today," she said. "We can finish tomorrow. Dinner will be ready soon." One by one, people drifted away to wash up, to sit, to breathe. George remained. He stood before the candles, watching the memories loop. Ginny approached him carefully, like someone coming near a wounded animal. "George," she said quietly. George didn't turn. His eyes stayed on Fred's dancing figure in the candlelight. "He made these for other people," George said. His voice was flat, but the words trembled underneath. "For people who lost someone." He was always thinking about other people, always trying to make things better. He swallowed. And now, his voice cracked. "Now I'm one of those people." Ginny stepped closer, standing beside him, shoulder almost touching his. "They're not showing you what you lost," she said gently. "They're showing you what you had. What you still have, in a way." George let out a shaky breath. "It doesn't feel like enough." "I know," Ginny whispered. "But it's what we have." They stood there, watching Fred smile and laugh and live in 7 golden pieces of candlelight. After a long time, Ginny spoke again. "I'm glad you lit them," she said. "It was brave." George's laugh came out thin, almost bitter. Didn't feel brave, felt necessary. His hand lifted, finger hovering near the flame without touching it. "He'd be annoyed at us," George said softly. "All this moping." Ginny's mouth twitched. "Probably." George's lips lifted into the smallest smile, like the ghost of the old one. "He'd do something to make us laugh," George murmured. "Yeah," Ginny said, voice thick. "He would." The candles burned through the night. Harry woke more than once and padded downstairs, half asleep. And each time he passed the sitting room, the mantel still glowed gold. The memories played quieter as the wax shortened, but they didn't stop. And each time George sat there watching them, motionless. Like if he looked away, the memories might vanish faster. By morning, the candles had burned down to stubs. Their magic flickered weakly. The images grew fainter, more translucent, like ghosts of ghosts. When Harry came downstairs, he found George still there. He looked like he hadn't moved in hours. Perhaps he hadn't. "George," Harry said softly. George's head turned slowly. His eyes were red-rimmed and raw. "You should sleep," Harry said. George shook his head. "Can't. I—" His voice was hoarse. "Every time I close my eyes," he whispered, "I see him, but not like this." He stared at the failing candle flames. "I see him after," George said. "I see the wall, the dust, the way he looked so surprised, like he couldn't believe." He stopped abruptly, jaw clenching like he was biting down on something that would destroy him if he let it out. Harry sat beside him on the sofa, unsure what words could possibly fit. The images flickered one last time. Fred laughing, always laughing, and then the light collapsed into darkness. The candles went out. Only wax remained, melted and hardened in uneven puddles. George stared at them. "They're gone," he said flatly. Harry swallowed. "The candles are gone," he said carefully. "The memories aren't." George's head snapped toward Harry. The rawness in his eyes was frightening. "Every day he gets a little more distant," George said, voice rising, shaking. "Every day I forget small things. The exact way he said something. The way he laughed at a particular joke." He stood abruptly and began to pace, the old motion returning like a curse. "It's like he's dying again," George said, words tumbling faster now, slowly, piece by piece, in my head. Harry stood too, not to stop him. Harry knew better than that, but to stay close, to be present. "That's not," Harry began. "You don't understand," George snapped. Not cruelly, just desperately. "You've lost people, yeah. I know you have. But you weren't," he struggled for words, hands clawing at the air. "We were two halves of one whole," George said, voice cracking. "From the moment we were born, we were never separate, never alone. And now He broke off, breath hitching. "Now I'm just half a person walking around pretending to be whole." The words poured out like a dam breaking. "Everyone keeps saying it'll get better," George said, pacing faster. "That time heals. But it doesn't, Harry. It doesn't get better." He shoved a hand through his hair, wild-eyed. "I wake up every morning, and for a second I forget," George said. "I think of something I want to tell him. Some joke we'd make. And I turn." He gestured violently toward the empty space beside him, as if Fred should be standing there. "And he's not." George's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "He's never there." Harry's chest ached. He could feel the truth of it like a bruise. George's pacing became more frantic. "And the shop," he said, anger sharpening the grief. "Everyone keeps saying Fred would want it to continue. Mum keeps saying it. Fred would want you to keep going, George." He laughed, but it was broken, jagged. "How can I?" George demanded. "Every inch of that place is him. Every product. Every joke. We made it together. There's no Weasley's Wizard Wheezes without both of us." He stopped pacing suddenly, shoulders shaking. "There's just me," George whispered. "Alone, pretending I'm enough." Harry's voice came out soft. "George." George didn't seem to hear him. "And the worst part," George said, voice rising again, "the absolute worst part is I'm angry at him." Harry's breath caught. "I'm furious," George spat, tears shining in his eyes now. "He's dead, and I'm angry at him for dying, for leaving me here." He stared at Harry like he expected condemnation. What kind of person is angry at their dead brother? Harry stepped closer, voice steady. "A person who's grieving," Harry said simply. George's breath hitched. "I should have been with him," George whispered. His voice shrank, turned into a wound. "When the wall fell, I was 20 feet away. 20. His hands shook. I saw it happening, and I tried to get to him, but there were Death Eaters and debris, and..." His knees buckled. George sank onto the sofa, face in his hands. The sound he made wasn't quite crying. It was deeper than that. Primal. Like the noise of something in him cracking. Harry sat beside him and put a hand on his shoulder. Not a fix, not a solution. Just a presence. They stayed like that a long time. George's breathing turned ragged, then quieter. The storm moved through him. Eventually, George's hands fell away. His face was wet, eyes red and exhausted. "Sorry," he muttered, voice raw. "Making a scene." "You're not," Harry said firmly. George let out a weak laugh. "Fred would say I am. He'd call you melodramatic," Harry agreed gently. "And then he'd sit with you until you felt better." George's face twisted, grief and love colliding. "Yeah," he whispered. He would. Footsteps on the stairs announced someone coming down. Ginny appeared in the doorway, took one look at George, and crossed the room without hesitation. She sat on his other side. She didn't speak. She just was there. Then Ron came, looking helpless and worried, and Hermione behind him with quiet competence. Bill and Charlie appeared half-dressed, hair tousled, blinking, sleep from their eyes. Percy hesitated in the doorway longer than anyone, then walked in and stood awkwardly, as if afraid of choosing the wrong place in the room. Arthur and Molly arrived last. Molly's face crumpled the moment she saw George. She moved toward him like gravity. George looked around at them all, as if stunned by the sight of so many people gathered for him. "I can't do this," he said, voice breaking. "Everyone keeps expecting me to be fine, to move on, to keep living." He swallowed hard. "But I don't know how to do that without him." "Then don't," Ginny said simply. George blinked at her. "What?" "Don't be fine," Ginny said, voice fierce in its tenderness. "Don't move on. Don't pretend you're okay when you're not." She leaned closer. "Just be however you need to be," Ginny said. "We're not going anywhere." Ron nodded, eyes shining. "She's right, mate. You think we expect you to be okay? We're all a mess." Charlie rubbed his face. "Some of us are just better at hiding it." Even through tears, George's mouth twitched. Molly moved fully in front of George and knelt so she could see his face. "My darling boy," she said, voice shaking. "You don't have to be anything for us. You don't have to be strong or brave or better. You just have to be here. That's all. Just be here." "The shop," George began weakly. "Bugger the shop," Bill said bluntly, then glanced at Molly. "Sorry, Mum. But it's true." "Boo." Molly didn't argue. She only watched George, like she was memorizing him. "The shop can wait," Bill continued. "It can close forever, if that's what you need. Nothing is more important than you." Arthur nodded, voice steady. "Fred built it because it brought him joy. If it only brings you pain right now, then it can wait." Fred would say the same. George stared down at his hands. "I don't know what brings me joy anymore," he admitted quietly. "Everything I liked, everything I was good at, it was all with him." Hermione's voice came soft and certain. "None of us knows how to do this. We're all learning. We all lost people in the war, George. We're all trying to figure out how to keep going when part of us wants to stop." She stepped closer. "But we do it together," Hermione said. "That's how we manage. Together." George's eyes lifted, scanning faces. His parents, his siblings, his sister, his friends, his family. Broken, exhausted, grieving, but standing. Showing up. George swallowed. "The shop," he said slowly. I can't run it alone." Ron straightened, sudden hope flickering. "You don't have to." George looked directly at Ron. "You said you'd help," George said. "Did you mean it?" Ron blinked, surprised by the intensity. "Of course, anything. I don't mean occasionally," George said carefully. "I mean properly. Being there. Learning it. Running it with me." He took a shaky breath. "I can't be Fred and George anymore," he whispered. "But maybe we could be George and Ron." The room went quiet, not from tension this time, but from the weight of the offer. Ron didn't hesitate. "Yeah," he said immediately. "Yeah, absolutely." He smiled shakily. "I'm rubbish at inventing things," Ron said. But I can run a till. I can deal with customers. I can do whatever you need. I'm there. George stared at him like he couldn't quite believe it. The Aurora program can wait, Ron added firmly, surprising even himself. This is more important. Something shifted in George's face, something like relief, like a knot loosening. He turned toward Molly, voice breaking again. I'm sorry, Mum, George whispered, for worrying you, for not eating, for not coming down, for... Stop, Molly said fiercely, cupping his face in her hands. You have nothing to apologize for. You're grieving your twin, she whispered. Your other half. There's no right way to do that. No timeline. George's eyes filled. But I heard you, George said, voice cracking. At night, when you think everyone's asleep. Molly's breath hitched. I heard you crying, George said. And I keep thinking if I could just pull myself together. George Weasley, Molly said, voice commanding now, like she was casting a spell. You listen to me. George froze. I'm not crying because of you, Molly said, tears sliding down her cheeks. I'm crying because my son died. The words landed hard, true and unbearable. I miss him so much, Molly whispered. Sometimes I can barely breathe. She leaned closer, forehead almost touching George's. But you, Molly said, voice trembling with fierce love, you being here, alive, even when you're hurting, that's the only thing keeping me going. George's breath broke. For a moment he made no sound at all, just a sharp, silent inhale that seemed to snag somewhere deep in his chest, like his body didn't know how to hold all of it at once. Then his shoulders folded forward, and the fight went out of him in one trembling collapse. Molly caught him. She moved with the instinct of a mother who had spent her life catching her children, catching them when they fell off broomsticks, when they tripped downstairs, when the world pushed too hard. She wrapped her arms around George, as if she could physically keep him in the world, as if the force of holding him could stop anything else from being taken. Arthur's hands came next, steady and sure, closing around them both. His arms were warm and strong, and he leaned his forehead briefly against Molly's hair, eyes shut tight. Ginny pressed in on George's other side, not speaking, just anchoring him. Ron stepped closer, then closer still, like he didn't know where to put his hands but knew he had to be there. Bill's palm landed gently on George's back. Charlie's hand hovered, then settled, firm and grounding. Hermione stood close, her presence calm, solid. Percy hesitated for the briefest second. One heartbeat of old instinct, old distance, then stepped in too. Awkwardly, carefully, he added his arm to the tangle, like he was learning how to belong again. They became a knot of people and grief and love. No one spoke. No one needed to. The burrow creaked around them, an old house shifting in the winter. But the sound didn't feel lonely. It felt like the house itself was breathing with them. George's face was buried against Molly's shoulder. His hands clutched at the fabric of her jumper, like he was afraid she might disappear. His body shook in deep, uneven tremors that went beyond tears, something closer to a storm passing through bone and muscle. Molly rocked him slightly, the way she would have rocked him when he was small. It's all right, she whispered again and again, though it wasn't a lie meant to erase pain. It was a promise meant to carry it. It's all right. You're here. You're... Arthur's voice came rough and low. We've got you, son. George made a broken sound, half laugh, half sob, like the words hit something tender. Time stretched. It didn't hurry them. Slowly, the trembling eased. George's breathing steadied into ragged pulls of air, then softer ones. He didn't lift his head, but his grip on Molly loosened just slightly, as if his hands were tired of holding on so hard. Eventually, Molly drew back enough to look at him. Her eyes were red. Her cheeks were wet. She didn't wipe them away. "There," she murmured, cupping George's face with both hands, thumbs brushing the tears from his skin with a gentleness that felt almost sacred. "There you are." George blinked, as if he hadn't realized he could still be found. His voice came out small and raw. "I can't." "You don't have to," Molly interrupted instantly, not letting him finish whatever cruel sentence he was about to lay on himself. "You don't have to be anything today." Bill exhaled through his nose, a sound like he'd been holding breath for hours. "And if anyone expects you to be fine, they can come and talk to me about it." Charlie's mouth twitched. Bill's in a mood. He'll frighten them. Ron scrubbed at his face with both hands, trying to hide that his eyes were shining. "We're all in a mood." Hermione stepped a little closer, her tone gentle but certain. "We'll take this one day at a time." Percy swallowed, jaw tight. 1 hour at a time, if that's what it takes. George's eyes flicked toward Percy, surprised as if he hadn't expected Percy's voice to enter the space so calmly. Percy didn't look away. Molly breathed out slowly, like she was releasing something she'd been carrying. "All right," she said, voice trembling but steadier now. "All right." "We're going to the kitchen." George blinked again. "What?" "We're going to eat something," Molly said firmly. And the firmness wasn't control this time. It was care with a backbone. Not a feast. Not a performance. Just something... Charlie cleared his throat. "And if anyone tries to make it weird, I'll throw a sausage at them." Ron snorted despite himself. "You would." "I absolutely would," Charlie confirmed, entirely serious. George's lips twitched, the barest hint of movement, like the ghost of a smile had wandered close but didn't know if it was welcome. Molly saw it. Her eyes softened. She stood first, offering a hand to George like he was allowed to take help. Like taking help didn't make him weak. George stared at her hand for a moment. Then he took it. He stood slowly, legs stiff from hours on the sofa, and let Molly steady him. Arthur's palm pressed briefly to George's shoulder. One solid squeeze, before Arthur stepped back, giving him space without leaving. They moved together into the kitchen. The kitchen, which had been too hot and too full yesterday, looked different now, not because the room had changed, but because the air had. It didn't feel like a stage.
It felt like a room people lived in.
Molly didn't immediately start flinging pans onto burners like she was trying to outrun the silence. She opened the cupboard and took out bread. She set it on the counter. Simple. Ordinary. Ron grabbed the kettle without being asked. Hermione began rinsing mugs. Bill found butter and jam. Charlie rummaged until he found something that looked like it might be leftover sausages. Percy hovered uncertainly, then, after a glance at Arthur, went to the drawer and pulled out cutlery, setting it on the table with careful precision. Like if he did it properly, the world might not fall apart. Ginny moved through the room quietly, touching Molly's elbow once as she passed, not needing words. Harry stood near the doorway for a second, watching them all fall into motion. Not frantic, not forced, just moving. It felt like the first real breath the burrow had taken in days. Molly set a plate on the table and then paused, as if her old habit might surge. An extra plate, automatically, for a son who would never walk in. Her hand hovered. Arthur's fingers brushed hers lightly. Molly swallowed. She did not set out the extra plate. Instead, she placed the plate back in the cupboard. She looked at Arthur, eyes wet again. Arthur nodded once. A silent, yes, that's okay. Molly turned away quickly and began slicing bread. Toast? Ron offered, voice deliberately casual. Molly almost said, "You'll burn it," and then she seemed to decide that it didn't matter if he did. Yes, she said. Toast is lovely. Charlie leaned on the counter. I'll supervise so he doesn't set the kitchen on fire. Ron gave him a look. You once tried to warm soup with a blasting curse. That was experimentation, Charlie said defensively. It was a scientific approach. Hermione lifted an eyebrow. It was chaos. Bill smiled faintly. It runs in the family. A tiny ripple of warmth moved through the room. George sat at the table, hands around a mug of tea Hermione had placed in front of him. He stared into it for a long moment, as though the steam was telling stories. His shoulders were still tense, still slightly hunched, like he expected pain to jump out from behind cupboards. But he was there. He was at the table. He was not upstairs behind a closed door, pacing a grief-shaped path in a room too quiet. Molly brought the bread over, set it down, then hesitated beside George like she didn't know whether touching him would help or hurt. George glanced up. His eyes were tired, but not empty in the way they'd been yesterday. He said softly, and the word alone seemed to steady her. Molly exhaled and rested a hand briefly on his shoulder. Just a touch, just a moment. I'm here, she whispered. George nodded once, swallowing hard. Yeah. They ate. Not a lot. Not with appetite. But they ate. Harry had never thought toast could feel like a victory. But there it was. Bread, warm in your hands, a small, ordinary thing that meant we are still doing this. George managed a few bites. He stopped, then forced another bite down. Eyes fixed on nothing. Molly didn't push. She didn't plead. She didn't say just one more for me. She watched quietly, relief and heartbreak living side by side in her face. That's good, she said softly, when George set the toast down. That's enough. George's throat bobbed. He started. Molly shook her head immediately. No. George blinked. What? No apologies, Molly said, voice steadier now. Not for this. Not for being alive. Not for hurting. Arthur sat beside her and took her hand. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, slow and absent-minded, like a spell of comfort he'd been casting for years. Hermione tidied the counter as they went, the way she always did when emotions threatened to flood a room. Small, practical tasks that built gentle walls. Charlie poured more tea. Ron scraped burnt crumbs off a piece of toast and ate it anyway, grimacing dramatically. It's charcoal, Ron announced. I've made charcoal. Charlie nodded gravely. Excellent. Very nutritious. Bill leaned over to George slightly, voice careful. Do you want, after you rest, do you want to talk about the shop? George's fingers tightened briefly around his mug. He didn't answer immediately. Harry watched his face, the way George's gaze flicked toward the window, toward the snow outside, like he was searching for the right direction to look when something hurt. Finally, George spoke quietly. "Not right now," he said. "But soon." Ron's shoulders eased. "Okay," Bill said simply. "Whenever." Percy set his mug down with a small clink. "I can help with paperwork," he offered, voice stiff but sincere. If you decide to do something with the business. Or if you decide not to. Either way." George's eyes moved to Percy again. Percy's face tightened, as if he expected to be rejected even now. George stared for a long moment. Then George nodded. Once. Small and jerky. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Percy's breath left him like he'd been holding it for months. After breakfast, George stood uncertainly, as if he didn't know what to do with himself when the moment wasn't actively surviving. "I'm going to..." he began, then paused. Ginny looked up.
What?
George rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly awkward in a way that reminded Harry painfully of the old George, the one who used to pretend not to care when he cared more than anyone.
I'm going to have a bath.
George said. "Actually wash." Charlie blinked exaggeratedly. "So you admit it? You do smell." Ron choked on his tea. Hermione covered her mouth, laughing quietly. George's eyes narrowed, and for one bright second, there it was, the old spark, sharp and alive. "You've always been rude," George said hoarsely. Charlie grinned.
It's my charm.
George shook his head, but the corner of his mouth lifted, the smallest smile. Broken around the edges, but real. He left the kitchen slowly and went upstairs. As soon as he was gone, Molly sagged into her chair, like all her bones had turned to tired. Arthur's hand tightened around hers. "He ate," Molly whispered, voice trembling with relief. "He talked." Arthur nodded, eyes shining. "He's trying." Bill leaned against the counter, rubbing a hand over his face. "That's all we can ask." Charlie's voice softened. "It's huge, Mum." Percy looked down at his hands, then up again, like he wanted to say something but didn't know how to make it come out without cracking. Hermione stepped closer to Molly and gently took plates from the table. "We'll keep helping," she said simply. "We'll keep sharing the weight." Molly blinked hard. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Hermione smiled, soft and steady. "You won't have to find out." Days later, when George came back downstairs, he looked more like himself. Clean hair, fresh clothes, skin less grey. The haunted look didn't disappear. It wouldn't, not quickly. But he looked present. He drifted toward the sitting room like it had become a gravity point, like something in there was waiting. And it was. The decorations from the attic still sat scattered across surfaces, half-finished garlands draped over chairs, ornaments in small piles. The room smelled faintly of pine and spice. The corner box, the one George had opened, sat near the mantel. The memory candles were gone now. Melted wax hardened in puddles from where they'd burned through the night. Molly had tried to clean it earlier, Harry noticed. Tried to scrape at the wax. Then stopped, leaving it there like evidence, like a mark that something had happened. George stood in front of the mantel and stared at the wax. Ginny appeared beside him, holding 2 cups of tea. She handed one to George without asking. He took it automatically. They stood there a long time without speaking, watching light from the window stretch across the floor. Finally, George spoke. Voice quiet. "It's strange," he said. "Watching those memories. Ginny's eyes stayed on the mantel.
Yeah, it didn't make it.
Better, George admitted. It wasn't meant to, Ginny said softly. George swallowed. It made it real. Ginny nodded once. Sometimes that's the first step. George's fingers tightened around his cup. His knuckles went pale. I keep thinking, George whispered, that if I don't hold on tight enough, he'll fade. Ginny's voice came gentle but firm. He won't. George laughed without humor. How do you know? Ginny turned her head and looked at him fully. Because he's everywhere, she said. In all of us. In everything in this house. In the way Mum says dear, the exact same way whether she's furious or proud. In Dad's terrible jokes. In Ron's dramatic suffering. In Percy's stubbornness. In your brain, in your hands. Her voice thickened. And in the fact that you're still here, Ginny whispered. Because he loved you. He loved all of us. That doesn't just disappear. George stared at her, eyes red-rimmed, and for a second he looked like he might break again. Instead, he nodded once, the motion small but stubborn. Okay, he said hoarsely. Okay. That afternoon, the burrow found a rhythm. Not the old rhythm, not the easy chaos of before, but a new one. Arthur disappeared into the shed for an hour, but he came back. Ron and Hermione argued gently about whether the garlands should be symmetrical. Percy tried to make the lights perfectly aligned, and failed, because nothing in the burrow had ever been perfectly aligned. Charlie found a box of old ornaments and enchanted one to hum. Molly made soup, just soup. Not 5 pots, not a full dinner for 30, just soup with bread and butter. Harry watched her stir it, and for the first time since arriving, her movements didn't feel like panic. They felt like feeding. George helped quietly, passing things when asked, stirring when Ron shoved a spoon at him and said, "Your turn, mate." George took the spoon and stirred. Simple, normal, and because it was simple and normal, it mattered. As evening settled, they finished the decorating. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't meant to be. A slightly crooked star on top. A garland that drooped too low over the staircase. Ornaments that clinked when the burrow creaked. But the room glowed. It looked like Christmas. And somehow, that didn't feel like betrayal. The burrow didn't suddenly become easy. It didn't snap back into the old shape, like a spell had been cast, and everything brightened into normal again. Grief didn't work that way. It didn't pack its bags because someone ate half a plate of toast, or because a family sat in the same room without shouting. But the house did settle into something gentler, not healed. Not fixed. Just steadier. That afternoon drifted by in quiet, practical motion. Small tasks that didn't ask too much of anyone. Molly moved between kitchen and sitting room with a bowl of soup and the careful calm of someone learning, in slow inches, that she didn't have to outrun sorrow to survive it. Arthur disappeared into the shed, but not for an entire day. He came back after an hour, cheeks pink from cold, hands smelling faintly of metal, and sat with a mug of tea like he was letting himself be seen again. Ron and Hermione took charge of the decorations in their own ways. Ron with enthusiasm, Hermione with a look that said, "If we are doing this, we are doing it properly." Percy tried to help without taking over. which seemed to require the kind of effort he usually reserved for ministry presentations. Charlie found a box of old ornaments and, because Charlie could never leave anything alone, charmed one to hum softly in a warm, wandering melody that made the room feel less empty. Ginny stayed close to George without hovering. She offered cups of tea. She nudged him into small conversations. She didn't ask him to be okay. She simply kept him within reach of the living. Harry watched all of it with the quiet intensity of someone who had spent too many years waiting for disaster. He had learned, long ago, to listen for cracks in the air, to count silences, to measure the way people held their shoulders when they were trying not to fall apart. But this was different than war. This wasn't a fight against an enemy. This was a fight against absence. And absence couldn't be hexed. It could only be carried. As evening arrived, the kitchen began to smell like cinnamon and cloves. Molly had decided, somewhere in the quiet of the afternoon, that Christmas Eve dinner would still happen. Not a feast built from panic, but a proper meal, measured and warm. Something you made because you fed people you loved. Something you made because feeding them was a way to say, I'm here. You're here. We're still doing this. Fleur arrived with Bill just as the sky outside turned a harder shade of blue. Harry heard the sound first, the softer, lilting edge of Fleur's voice mixed with Bill's familiar tone, and underneath it, bright and delighted, baby laughter. Ginny, who had been standing by the window, said quietly, They're here. Harry turned in time to see Bill step into the kitchen with Fleur close behind him, her silver blonde hair pinned back and her cheeks flushed from cold. In Fleur's arms was Victoire, bundled in a thick coat, round-faced and wide-eyed, making curious little noises at the warm, crowded room. The sight of her hit Harry with an unexpected force. New life, something soft and small and alive, in a house that had been holding so much death. Molly made a sound that was half gasp, half joy, and she crossed the room quickly. Oh, let me see you, my darling girl, Molly breathed, and for a moment she looked like the Molly Harry remembered, whole and radiant, as if love could still light her from the inside. Victoire stared at Molly with solemn intensity, then grabbed at a strand of Molly's hair, like she owned it. Fleur laughed. She is, how you say, opinionated. That's a Weasley trait, Charlie called from the sitting room. Bill grinned. She gets it from both sides. Harry hovered near the doorway, watching George. George had been in the pantry, taking out flour at Molly's request, and he stopped when he saw the baby. For a second, Harry worried the sight of her would cut too deep, that it would remind George of all the future moments Fred would never see. George's face softened instead, not into happiness, but into something warmer than numbness. He stepped closer, hesitant. Can I? George asked, voice careful. Harry didn't wait for Fleur to offer. He simply moved forward and held his arms out. Because sometimes you didn't ask grief what it wanted. Sometimes you just put something human in its path and hoped it would choose to hold it. Fleur shifted Victoire gently into George's arms. George held her awkwardly at first, like he might break. Victoire immediately reached up and grabbed his hair with surprising strength. George flinched. Merlin, you're stronger than you look, Victoire babbled happily, as if she had done something impressive. A tiny ripple of laughter moved through the kitchen. Bill watched George with careful casualness, like he was trying not to spook the moment. You're doing great, Bill said softly. George adjusted his hold, and his shoulders, so tense for days, eased by a fraction. Hello there, George murmured to the baby, voice gentler than Harry had heard it in months. Littlest Weasley. Causing trouble already, are you? Victoire made a delighted gurgling noise and tugged his hair again. George's mouth twitched. Harry felt something in his chest loosen just slightly. Molly watched with her hands pressed to her apron, eyes shining. Fleur stepped close and touched George's arm briefly. "Merci," she said quietly. For holding her. George looked up, startled, like he hadn't expected gratitude for something so small. "Yeah," he said, voice rough. "Yeah, okay." He didn't hand Victoire back right away. He stood there with her a few more moments, letting her tiny weight rest against him, letting her warmth exist in his arms as something real and undeniable. When he finally returned her to Fleur, his arms fell away, slowly, reluctant, like he was learning, slowly, that it was allowed to hold something good without betraying what was lost. Dinner preparations became, strangely, almost pleasant. Charlie told absurd stories about dragon mishaps in Romania. How a young dragon had mistaken his boot for food. How a handler had tried to impress someone by getting too close and had ended up with his eyebrows singed off. Bill countered with curse-breaking tales that made Harry's skin crawl even without details. Small, casual mentions of ancient spells that could turn bone to glass, or vaults that tried to drown you in sand. Even Percy contributed, offering dry observations about ministry incompetence that made Ron laugh into his mug. Molly and Fleur worked side by side, and something about that felt important. Fleur didn't try to replace Molly. She didn't step into the kitchen like a second mother. She simply helped. She moved with quiet confidence, offering small suggestions in her accented English. "You add Z herbs at Z end," Fleur said, sprinkling something fragrant over a pot. "Otherwise, they lose their flavor." Molly frowned, watching carefully. "I never knew that. I've been doing it wrong for years. I've been doing it to—" Fleur smiled warmly. "Not wrong. Just different. There are many ways to cook, many ways to love." Molly blinked hard at that, then nodded as if she couldn't speak. Harry saw her shoulders relax, just a little, as if the kitchen, her battlefield, her shelter, her refuge, was finally becoming a shared space again. When dinner was ready, they gathered around the extended table. The food was abundant, but not excessive. Roast and chicken and ham, potatoes and vegetables, bread and butter. A real Christmas meal made by hands that were trying their best. The conversation moved more naturally than it had the first night. There were still pauses, still moments where silence fell like a heavy cloth, but the pauses didn't feel like accusations. They felt like breath. George was quieter than the others, but he was present. He passed dishes when asked. He took a portion without Molly urging. He ate slowly, not much, but enough that Molly's eyes filled again and she turned her face away quickly, as if embarrassed by relief. After dinner, they drifted into the sitting room. The tree glittered. The garlands drooped in slightly uneven loops. The old burrow sofa looked threadbare and beloved. Someone, Arthur probably, had started a fire in the fireplace. Between firelight and the soft glow of the decorations, the room felt warm in a way that wasn't just physical. Victoire, bundled in Fleur's arms, was already drifting to sleep, her tiny fingers curling around a toy dragon Bill had bought her. They settled into chairs and onto the floor like they always had, like the burrow had always been a place where bodies gathered close, because closeness was part of how the house worked. Charlie sprawled on the rug like a content animal. Bill and Fleur took the love seat. Ron and Hermione claimed the sofa with Ginny, and Harry sat on the floor near the fire, leaning against Ginny's legs, the way he had done years ago when he'd first come here and couldn't quite believe there was a place in the world where people wanted him nearby. Percy sat in a straight-back chair, posture still formal, but he looked softer, as if being here was sanding down sharp edges he didn't know how to put away. Arthur and Molly sat in their usual places, hands clasped between them. George sat in his chair, the one beside the empty space where Fred should have been. The gap was still visible, but it didn't feel like an open wound in quite the same way. It felt like a place they were learning to acknowledge without falling into. Charlie clapped his hands once. Story time, Ron groaned immediately.
Not the one about the gnome in the chimney.
You were 4, Ginny said. Get over it. It was traumatic, Ron insisted. Charlie grinned. That's exactly why we're doing it. Arthur cleared his throat, and the room quieted instinctively, because Arthur telling stories had always been part of the burrow's magic. He didn't tell them to show off. He told them like he was inviting you into a memory and letting you sit down there with him for a while. Oh. Tell one, Arthur said. A true one. Molly's smile appeared, fragile and fond. Oh, no. Oh, yes, Arthur said with mock sternness. It's the Christmas before Ginny was born. Ginny made a face. Dad, Arthur lifted a finger. We had 5 boys under 12, he began. Molly was 8 months pregnant, and, for some reason, we decided to host Christmas here. Charlie laughed. For some reason? Arthur nodded gravely. For some reason. It was the first time we'd ever tried it. Molly's brothers were coming, my parents, various aunts and uncles, proper gathering. Hermione leaned forward, caught despite herself. What happened? Arthur paused for effect. Christmas Eve arrives, and with it comes the worst blizzard we'd seen in decades. Bill groaned. Oh, I remember this. Snow up to the windows, Arthur continued. No one could apparate, couldn't see 3 feet in front of your face. And everyone was supposed to arrive that evening, Molly added, eyes bright with memory. Arthur nodded. So there we are, 5 boys running wild, snowed in, and Molly cut in, half laughing now. I went into labor. Hermione's eyes widened. You're joking. Not even slightly, Arthur said, delighted by the reaction. Tried to flow for a healer. Flew network was down because of the storm. Tried to send an owl. No owl was flying in that weather. Molly leaned back, amused now. So Arthur had to deliver Ginny himself. Bill raised both hands. With my help. Arthur grinned. Bill was 11. I was very brave, Bill protested. You fainted, Charlie said instantly. Bill glared. Once. Arthur nodded thoughtfully. Twice. Bill pointed at him. Once. The second time, I was just resting my eyes. Ron laughed, loud enough that it filled the room, and Harry saw Molly's face soften at the sound. Arthur continued, voice gentler now. Ginny arrived just after midnight, technically Christmas morning, screaming her head off. Ginny huffed. And then, Arthur said, eyes shining, she started laughing. The room went quiet in that particular way it did when something tender had been set down in front of everyone. The storm cleared, Molly whispered. Just like that. The moment she was born, the snow stopped and the stars came out. The relatives arrived an hour later, Arthur said. Found us exhausted with a brand new baby girl and the boys asleep in corners. Molly smiled at Ginny with a softness that could have made Harry ache. Best Christmas ever. Ginny swallowed and looked at her hands, blinking a little too hard. I've always been dramatic, Ginny muttered. Ron snorted. More stories followed. Ron told one about the year Fred and George had enchanted all the presents to open themselves. Wrapping paper flying, ribbons attacking ankles, Molly chasing a box that kept sprinting away. Hermione shared her first Christmas at the Burrow, nervous and terrified that she'd say the wrong thing, only to be hugged so hard by Molly that she'd nearly stopped breathing. Bill described proposing to Fleur on Christmas Eve. How he'd barely got the words out before she'd said yes, eyes bright and fearless. Even Percy spoke, hesitantly at first, about the Christmas he'd been made prefect. How insufferable he'd been, how proud. And then, Percy admitted, cheeks colouring, Fred and George hid my badge in the turkey. Arthur chuckled. Found it when I was carving. When... Percy's mouth twitched. I remember. I was furious. And later that night, Molly said quietly, voice softening, Fred gave you the badge back, cleaned it and everything. He told me afterwards he was proud of you, Percy. Even when you were being a pompous little... Mum, Percy said, scandalized. Molly's eyes shone.
He did. He meant it.
Percy swallowed hard, staring at the fire like it was the only safe place to look. The room fell into a comfortable silence after that, the kind made from shared memory rather than unsaid pain. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle and soft, tapping quietly at the windows, as if the night itself was listening. This is nice, George said suddenly. Everyone looked at him, startled, not because he had spoken, but because his voice held something new. Not brightness, but presence. Being here, George continued, eyes on the fire, all of us telling stories. Remembering. It hurts, he admitted, but it's good hurt. He gave a small, bleak smile. Does that make sense? Arthur's voice came immediately, warm and sure. Perfect sense. George breathed out, and for a moment his shoulders loosened. Fred would be annoyed at us, George added. And there was something familiar, just under his words. All this sitting around being somber. Aha, aha, Ron snorted. He'd hex our tea. He'd charmed the Christmas pudding to sing, Charlie said. He'd definitely tried to turn Percy's hair blue, Ginny said, eyes sparking suddenly, mischief rising like a small flame. George's mouth twitched. Absolutely. Percy's hair. Percy sat up straighter. No. Ron pointed at him. Yes. Hermione's eyes brightened with reluctant amusement. We are not turning Percy's hair blue. George looked at Hermione, and for the first time in days his gaze held a flicker of humor. What about his teacup? George suggested innocently. Hermione stared at him, then sighed, as if resigned to the family she'd married into. A teacup is not a person. That's not a no, Charlie said delightedly. And just like that, the room shifted. Something loosened. They spent the next hour coming up with ridiculous, harmless nonsense. Things Fred would have approved of not because they were clever, but because they were silly. The ornaments on the tree ended up singing a slightly off-key carol that Hermione insisted on correcting, and somehow only made worse. The snow outside the window began to fall in spirals instead of straight lines, drifting upward now and then, like it had forgotten gravity. Percy's teacup turned a vivid shade of electric purple the moment he set it down, and Percy stared at it like he'd been personally insulted. Ron wheezed. "It suits you." "It does not suit me," Percy said stiffly. Charlie beamed. "It absolutely suits you." And then George laughed. It wasn't big. It wasn't easy. It came out rusty, surprised, like his body had forgotten it could make that sound and had stumbled into it by accident. But it was real. The room went still for half a heartbeat, everyone's breath catching on the sound. Then Molly made a broken little noise and turned her face away quickly, wiping her cheek with the edge of her sleeve like she was furious with herself for crying. Arthur's eyes shone in the firelight. Ginny's lips trembled into a smile that looked like relief. Ron laughed harder, because Ron always responded to emotion by turning it into noise. And George pressed his hand briefly to his mouth as if startled by himself. He started, voice rough. Charlie grinned at him. "There he is." George huffed, but he didn't deny it. When the clock struck midnight, they were still awake. The fire burned low. The tree lights twinkled. Victoire slept in Fleur's arms, tiny and peaceful. The burrow felt full, not of noise, not of chaos, but of bodies gathered close, choosing to stay. Molly stood and cleared her throat. "We should do it," she said softly. Everyone looked up. "The Christmas candle," Ginny said, nodding. "The one we light every year." It had been a tradition for as long as Harry had known the Weasleys. A thick red candle carved with old runes, charmed to burn steadily through the night until Christmas morning. It was hope made into flame, light kept alive in the darkest part of winter. Molly's expression faltered. "I don't know if we have it. I haven't seen it since." Her words drifted off. George spoke quietly. "I have it." Heads turned. George's face was pale, but steady. "Heads." "I took it after," George admitted. "I kept it in my room. I wasn't sure if we should light it this year." The room held its breath. George looked around at them. At his parents, his siblings, his family, his friends. "But I think we need to," George said, voice rough. "I think Fred would want us to." He left the sitting room and returned a moment later, carrying the candle. It was thick and old and carved with runes that caught the firelight. The red wax looked almost like it glowed from within. George placed it on the small table beside the tree. His hand hovered over it. And for a second, Harry thought he might stop. Then Molly stepped forward and laid her hand over George's. "Together," Molly whispered. "We light it together." Arthur joined them, then Bill and Fleur balancing Victoire carefully. Then Charlie, Percy, Ron and Hermione, Ginny and Harry, hands overlapping, a tangle of fingers around red wax. "For hope," Molly said. "For light," Arthur added. "For love," Hermione whispered. "For family," Bill said. George swallowed. "For Fred," George said, voice steady. "And for everyone we've lost," Ginny added softly. Arthur raised his wand with his free hand. The tip glowed warm. The flame that appeared was gold and gentle. It touched the wick. The candle caught. It burned bright, steady and strong, not flickering wildly, not sputtering, steady. The light filled the room with a warmth that didn't erase grief but softened it, like a blanket laid gently over sharp edges. Fleur breathed. "It is beautiful." And it was. They stood together in the candlelight, quiet, watching the flame move like a living thing. Harry felt something settle in his chest. Not happiness, not relief. Something deeper, an understanding that grief could live alongside hope, that pain didn't cancel love, that a family could be broken and still be a family. Arthur cleared his throat and gave a watery sort of chuckle. "Right," he said, voice gruff. Ooh. Who wants to help me with sleep? Ron muttered. Charlie laughed. Too late. We've started a tradition. Now we have to do it properly. Molly's smile trembled. "We can sleep soon," she said. "Just let it burn a bit longer." They stayed, talking softly, watching the fire and the candle, letting the night be what it was. Not perfect, but theirs. And when they finally drifted to bed, one by one, the candle still burned in the sitting room, steady and bright, holding light through the dark, the way Fred once had. The candle burned on after they went to bed. Harry woke in the night once, half awake and thirsty, and padded quietly down the hall. The burrow was never truly silent, not even when everyone slept. It sighed and creaked in the cold, floorboards settling, pipes whispering, the soft living sounds of a house that had seen generations of laughter and arguments and slammed doors and reconciliations. When Harry passed the sitting room, he stopped. The Christmas candle still burned, steady and bright. Its flame didn't flicker wildly like ordinary fire. It held its shape, calm and warm, throwing soft gold over the tree and garlands, over the scattered ornaments that hadn't been put away yet, over the puddles of hardened wax left from the memory candles. And there, in the dim glow, sat George. He was in the chair beside the empty space, shoulders hunched forward, elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped. His face looked carved from exhaustion, but his eyes were open and fixed on the flame, as if he were keeping watch, as if the candle might go out if he blinked too long. Harry didn't speak. He didn't step into the room and ask if George was all right, because the answer was obvious, and because sometimes the kindest thing you could do was not force someone to translate pain into words. Harry simply stood in the doorway for a moment, letting George know, without making it a conversation, that he wasn't alone in the house. George didn't look up, but his shoulders eased just slightly, like he felt the presence. Harry went back upstairs. Later, when he woke again, the house was quieter. The candle still burned. George was still there. By morning, the candle had burned down to a thick stub. The runes carved into its wax softened and blurred by heat. Its light was dimmer but still steady, like it had given everything it could and refused to stop early. Christmas morning, at the Barrow, arrived in an unusual hush. No thunder of feet on the stairs, no whoops of excitement, no Fred and George bursting into rooms with some ridiculous prank that would have sent everyone shouting and laughing and swearing. Instead, pale winter light slid through frost-painted windows, and the first sounds Harry heard were muffled voices downstairs, low, careful, as if everyone was stepping around something fragile. Ginny was awake beside him, staring up at the ceiling. "First Christmas without him," she said quietly, as if naming it made it real. Harry's throat tightened. Ginny swallowed. "It feels wrong, waking up and knowing he won't," her voice caught. She drew a slow breath in, the way she'd learned to do when emotion threatened to take over. But we're doing it anyway. Harry turned his head to look at her. We are we. They lay there a moment longer, gathering courage the way people gather blankets in winter, pulling it close, wrapping it tight, taking warmth where you could. Then they got up. Downstairs, the burrow looked softer in daylight. The decorations glowed gently, no longer dramatic in candlelight, but comforting, settled. The tree stood in the corner with its slightly crooked star. The garlands drooped in imperfect loops. The sitting room smelled faintly of pine and smoke, and something sweet from the kitchen. Under the tree, presents had appeared. Some were wrapped neatly, others hastily. Some had been repaired with tape where paper had torn. All of them sat in a pile that looked like joy, trying its best. In the kitchen, Arthur and Molly sat at the table with mugs of tea. George sat with them, quieter than the others, but there. His hair was damp. He must have washed properly after all, and his face was drawn with tiredness, but his eyes looked clearer than they had in days. Molly looked up when Harry and Ginny entered, and gave them a small smile that held more love than brightness. "Morning, dears," she said. "Tea's fresh. Breakfast won't be ready for a bit. I thought we'd wait for everyone." George glanced up too. "Happy Christmas," he said, voice subdued but not hollow. "Happy Christmas," Harry and Ginny replied. Slowly, one by one, the others appeared. Bill and Fleur came down first, Victoire wide awake, and babbling cheerfully as if she'd sensed the mood and decided it needed fixing. Charlie stumbled in next with his hair standing up at ridiculous angles. Ron and Hermione followed, sleepy and warm together. Percy arrived last, already dressed neatly, as if he'd been awake for an hour and didn't want anyone to know. They gathered in the sitting room, without needing to decide to. It was where the tree was, where the presents were, where the last stub of the Christmas candle still glowed faintly on the small table beside it, like a heart that had refused to stop. Arthur lowered himself into his chair and cleared his throat. "Well," he said gently, "shall we?" It had always been Fred and George's job to hand out presents. They'd made it a performance every year, throwing packages, making them fly, pretending to accidentally give Percy a box that hissed or vibrated, charming Ron's to hop away and hide under the sofa. The absence of that chaos sat in the room like a shadow. For a moment, no one moved. Then George stood. "I'll do it," he said quietly. If that's all right." Molly's eyes filled immediately, but she nodded. "Of course, love." George knelt beside the tree and began pulling packages out one by one, reading names, handing them over carefully. His movements were deliberate, controlled. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. Because if he let himself slip into the old rhythm too quickly, it might break him. He handed Victoire a small parcel first, because that was tradition. Bill helped the baby unwrap it, and she immediately squealed with delight as a soft toy dragon flapped its little wings and made a tiny puffing noise like pretend fire. Her laughter cut through the room like sunlight. People smiled without meaning to. Even Percy's face softened. Then the presents continued. Harry received a new watch from Molly and Arthur. "Since your old one was destroyed in the battle," Molly said, voice wobbling. "And because I like you knowing the time." "I like knowing you are here." Harry swallowed hard and managed, "Thank you," which didn't feel like enough, but Molly's hand squeezed his shoulder as if she understood. From Ron and Hermione, Harry received a stack of oral training manuals, heavy and serious, except Ron had scribbled sarcastic comments in the margins, making the books feel less like studying and more like a shared joke. From Ginny, Harry received a folded parchment sealed with wax. He opened it and read, "One full day of whatever you want. No questions asked." Harry looked up, grinning despite everything. "That's dangerous." Ginny's eyes sparkled. "I'm brave." Ron made a gagging noise. "Merlin, get a room." Hermione elbowed him automatically, like it was muscle memory. George received practical things first. New clothes from Molly, tools from Arthur, a small notebook from Hermione with careful ideas written inside for future products, a bottle of fire whiskey from Charlie. George accepted each gift with a quiet, awkward nod, like he didn't know how to be the center of attention without Fred there to take half the weight. Then Ron handed George something wrapped in plain paper. George opened it slowly and froze. It was a framed photograph. The joke shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezers, on opening day. Fred and George stood in front of it with their arms around each other's shoulders, identical grins splitting their faces. In the moving loop of the photo, Fred nudged George. George nudged back. They laughed silently, forever caught in that moment. George stared at it for a long time, thumb tracing the edge of the frame. Ron shifted awkwardly. "Thought you might want it. For when you go back." "So he's sort of there." George's voice came thick. "Thanks, Ron." He swallowed. "Really? That's... thanks." Ron's ears went red. "Yeah. Ah. Well, don't get soppy." George gave a tiny huff that might almost have been a laugh. Percy handed Molly his gift next, because Percy, for all his stiffness, had decided to try being brave. It was a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. Molly opened it and found a tiny crystal vial filled with silvery light. "A memory," Percy said quickly, as if rushing would stop him from changing his mind. "From my first Christmas home, after I came back, Fred was trying to teach me how to make treacle tart. I was terrible. I kept burning things. He kept laughing. Not cruelly, just happy I was there trying." Percy's voice cracked. "I thought you might like to have it." Molly didn't speak. She stood up, crossed the room, and hugged Percy so fiercely his glasses went crooked. Arthur rose too, placing a hand on Percy's back, steady and warm. Percy's eyes shut tight. His hands hovered, then finally wrapped around his mother, like he'd been waiting years to do it properly. The presents continued. Paper and ribbon piled up. Victoire fell asleep in a nest of wrapping paper, clutching her toy dragon-like treasure. For a while, the room sounded almost normal. Soft laughter, teasing, murmured thank yous, the gentle chaos of people being together. Then George reached for a package wrapped in familiar purple paper, covered in tiny golden snitches. His hand stilled. He turned it over slowly, reading the tag to George. From Fred, and underneath, written in smaller letters, "Open only when you're ready to laugh again." The room went absolutely silent. Even the fire seemed to hush. George stared at the package as if it might bite him. His breathing went shallow. Molly made a small sound, like her heart had been punched. Arthur's arm slid around her shoulders. Ron looked stricken, like he'd forgotten this kind of thing could exist, like he'd forgotten the past could leave traps in the present. George's fingers tightened around the paper. "He must have," George's voice cracked. "He must have put this under the tree last year. Before before walls fell, before dust, before the world broke. Ron spoke softly, barely above a whisper. Are you going to open it? George stared at it a long moment. Then, carefully, he set it aside. Not yet, George said hoarsely. He looked up, and the smile he managed was watery and fragile, but it was there. But eventually. When I'm ready? Molly pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling over despite her efforts. Arthur kissed her temple and held her tighter. No one pushed George. No one tried to persuade him. They simply let the gift sit there beside him, like a promise. Like a doorway that could be opened when he chose. And then, because that was the strange mercy of families, life kept moving. More presents were opened. More paper tore. More small smiles appeared. The mourning continued, not because grief vanished, but because they were refusing to let grief be the only thing in the room. When the last package was opened, Molly stood and clapped her hands once, briskly, like she was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. Right, she announced. Breakfast. Proper Christmas breakfast. Ron groaned happily. Yes. Molly pointed at him immediately. Everyone helps. They trooped into the kitchen as a group, and the work, miraculously, felt almost joyful. Charlie cracked eggs with unnecessary flair until Hermione told him to stop showing off. Ron burned the toast and was instantly demoted to setting the table. Hermione proved surprisingly good at pancakes, which she acted mildly annoyed about, as if competence in the kitchen was an inconvenience. Percy demonstrated a charm for keeping bacon perfectly crisp that he claimed to have learned from a ministry cafeteria worker. Ron stared at him like he'd grown an extra head. You've been holding out on us, Ron accused. Percy sniffed. Not everything I know is useless. George stood near the stove with Ginny, stirring porridge slowly. He looked more present with something to do, something simple and ordinary, that didn't demand emotion, but still placed him in the middle of life. Harry noticed George glance at the old Weasley clock on the wall, home, travelling, work, lost, and at the pin that would never move again. Fred's pin rested at home. It had been moved there after the war, because Molly couldn't bear anything else. George looked at it for a long moment. He didn't flinch away. Then he returned to stirring. Breakfast was loud and messy, and, in its own quiet way, perfect. Elbows bumped. Plates! Passed. Victoire woke and demanded attention, which Charlie provided by making faces that had her giggling. Plates! Bill told a story that made Molly threaten to cover Victoire's ears, even though the baby was too young to understand a single word. Halfway through, George spoke. I've been thinking, he said, and the table quieted. Not because anyone wanted to pressure him, but because everyone knew this mattered. About the shop, George continued. About what comes next. Ron sat up straighter, like a dog hearing its name. I want to reopen after the new year, George said slowly. But I want to do it right, not just pretend everything's the same. Arthur's eyes were gentle. What are you thinking? George swallowed. A memorial corner. Nothing huge. Just a space for Fred. Photos. His favorite products. A guest book where people can write memories. Molly's face crumpled softly. He'd love that. George nodded, and Ron's agreed to help. Ron immediately said properly, as if he needed to prove it. George's mouth twitched.
properly.
Hermione leaned forward. We could do a reopening event. Make it a celebration. Charlie grinned. Free samples. Everyone loves free samples. Bill added thoughtfully. And a portion of the opening day proceeds could go to something meaningful. A fund. For kids who lost people in the war. Help them have something good. George stared at his plate, thinking. Then he looked up, and there was something like purpose in his eyes. The Fred Weasley Memorial Fund for Magical Mischief and Childhood Joy. George said slowly, testing the words. Ron blinked. That's actually brilliant. It sounds exactly like him, Ginny whispered, eyes shining. Percy cleared his throat, voice careful. I can help with paperwork. Setting up a fund, I can do that. Hermione nodded briskly. I can organize the event. Bill said, I'll do the security charms. Charlie said, I'll bring something ridiculous from Romania that can be turned into novelty items. Arthur looked around the table at his children, grown, battered, still standing. That, he said quietly, is a very good plan. George stared at them all, and his shoulders eased like something heavy had shifted. It didn't make him happy. It didn't erase the hole, but it gave the hole edges they could build around. After breakfast, the washing up became a group effort, despite Molly's old instinct to protest. They cleaned as a messy line, someone washing, someone drying, someone putting away. Mundane work with clear endings. And then, without anyone suggesting it, they all bundled into coats and boots and went outside. The garden was blanketed in fresh snow. The sky was pale and bright, the cold was sharp but clean, the kind that woke you up and made you feel like you were breathing properly. Ron stepped into the snow, turned, and announced, Snowball fight. Hermione stared. Ron pointed at her. Don't Ron me. It's tradition, Charlie laughed. Teams? Ron grinned. Bill, Charlie, Percy against me, Harry and George. Percy looked offended immediately. That's not fair. Charlie clapped him on the shoulder. You have Bill. He's worth 2 normal people. Bill raised his eyebrows. I don't know if that's a compliment. It's not, Charlie said cheerfully. They divided up anyway, more or less, with Ginny and Hermione forming their own alliance. We're going to destroy everyone, Ginny declared with absolute confidence. Fleur watched from the kitchen window, holding Victoire, looking like she was half amused and half convinced they were all insane. What followed was chaos, the good kind. Snowballs flew in messy arcs. Someone, definitely Charlie, started using magic to make his snowballs bigger. Ron retaliated by charming a whole pile of snow into neatly formed ammunition. Percy, taking it far too seriously, constructed an actual snow fort with battlements. Charlie immediately demolished it with a well-aimed charm, and Percy's outraged sputtering echoed across the garden. George started slowly, standing on the edge, like he didn't know if he belonged in joy. Then Ron hit Percy square in the face with a perfect snowball. Percy gasped, like he'd been personally attacked by the concept of fun. And George laughed. It burst out of him, surprised, real, like it had been hiding in his chest and slipped free. Harry saw George's expression change with the sound, as if George himself couldn't believe it. And then George was in it. He made snowballs with methodical efficiency and threw them with deadly aim. He caught Ron in the back of the head. He hit Charlie in the chest. He nailed Percy twice in quick succession when Percy tried to retaliate. Ron spluttered, wiping snow from his hair. Merlin, George, when did you get good at this? George's smile was small, sharp, and achingly familiar. I've always been good, he said. Fred was just louder about it. He paused, and the smile softened, sad but real. But he's not here to show off, George added, so I get to win. They played until everyone was soaked and freezing and laughing, until Fleur opened the window and called them idiots in affectionate exasperation, until hot chocolate became a necessity rather than a treat. Trudging back inside, wet and exhausted, Harry found himself walking beside George. You okay? Harry asked quietly. George considered, honest as always. No, he said. Then, after a beat, but maybe, eventually, today helped. Harry nodded. Fred would have loved that. George snorted softly. He'd have cheated outrageously. Absolutely, Harry agreed. George's smile lingered a moment, then faded gently into something calmer. Inside, hot chocolate waited. Molly had also made soup, simple soup, because feeding people warm things was how she loved. They dried off near the fire, passed Victoire around, told exaggerated stories about the snow fight, laughed at Percy's ruined dignity. As afternoon faded, people began to drift. Bill and Fleur decided to head home so Victoire could sleep properly. Charlie announced he needed to return to Romania. Percy, surprisingly, said he was taking a few extra days off work to stay, if that was all right. Molly looked stunned, then delighted. Of course it's all right. The house slowly emptied until it was back to the core group again. Arthur, Molly, George, Ron, and Hermione. Ginny and Harry, and Percy, lingering like he'd finally decided to stop leaving. That evening, the burrow felt quieter, but not empty. Not the painful emptiness of the first night. A softer quiet. A quiet that had laughter inside it, like embers under ash. Later, when they finally went to bed, Harry and Ginny lingered in the sitting room for a moment, neither quite ready to leave the warmth of the day behind. It was a good Christmas, Ginny whispered. Harry nodded. Yeah. Ginny's voice shook slightly. George smiled more than once. He did. Ginny leaned into him. We're going to be okay. It sounded like she was trying the words on, testing whether they could fit. Harry held her tighter. We will, he said, not as a promise of perfection, but as a promise of continuing. Upstairs, the burrow creaked with people settling, floorboards sighing, a door closing, soft footsteps, and then Harry heard another sound. A drawer. Opening. Something being placed carefully on a nightstand. Harry's breath caught. Fred's present. George had taken it to his room. He hadn't opened it tonight. Harry knew that. But he had brought it close, like a small private lantern he could keep beside him until he was ready. The Christmas candle downstairs had finally burned out, but its absence didn't feel like loss. It had done what it was meant to do. It had burned through darkness. It had held steady, just like Fred had. Hash, 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 hash epilogue. 6 months later, spring came, even after the longest winter. The world didn't ask permission. It simply softened at the edges. Snow melting, ground thawing, leaves returning, light stretching longer into the evenings. 6 months after that first brutal Christmas, the sign above the shop door still read *Weasley's, Wizard Wheezes, *to Boneberg, in cheerful letters. But beneath it, new words had been added. In loving memory of Fred Weasley, who made the world laugh. George stood in front of the door with Ron beside him. The street around them was crowded. More people than George had expected. Old customers, Hogwarts friends, strangers who'd only heard the story, people who wanted to support the fund, people who simply wanted to be part of something hopeful. Inside the shop, a corner had been set aside, a memorial space. Photographs of Fred, laughing, inventing, showing off, grinning like he owned the world. His favorite products arranged neatly. A guest book, open on a table, already filled with messy handwriting and small stories, jokes and thank yous. And above it all, one single enchanted candle burned steadily. One of the last memory candles George had managed to salvage and improve. It didn't loop the battle. It didn't show the end. It showed joy. Little moments of Fred alive and bright, like a reminder that grief did not get to own the whole story. Ron elbowed George gently. Ready? George's hand rested on the door handle. He thought of Fred. Always, always. But the thought didn't drag him under the way it used to. Now it steadied him. It reminded him why this mattered. In his pocket, George carried something folded and worn, Fred's note. He had opened it 3 weeks ago, alone late at night, when the shop felt too heavy and the world felt too sharp. Inside the purple paper had been a simple message, written in Fred's messy hand. Told you you'd be ready to laugh again. Now get back to work, you lazy git. People need joy. Go make some. And underneath, love your better-looking twin. Tucked beside the note had been a single skiving snack box labeled, for when running the shop gets too hard. Take as needed. George had laughed until he cried. Then he'd wiped his face, got up, and gone back to work. Now, standing beside Ron, hearing the buzz of the crowd, smelling the familiar chaos of his own shop waiting behind the door, George drew a breath. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, I'm ready. He opened the door. The crowd surged forward. The shop came alive again. Laughter, bright color, the joyful nonsense of magical mischief. And somewhere, George was certain, Fred was watching, grinning, probably planning to haunt the shelves just to rearrange things when no one looked. The thought made George smile. The winter after the war had been long and cold, but spring came anyway, as it always does, even when you aren't ready for it. The burrows still stood crooked against the sky, held together by magic and love and the stubborn refusal to let grief be the final word. Inside its mismatched walls, the Weasleys kept learning what so many people have to learn. That healing isn't forgetting. That moving forward doesn't mean leaving anyone behind. Fred lived in laughter shared around a kitchen table, in products that made children giggle, in stories told by firelight, in George's determination to keep creating, in Ron's loyalty, in Ginny's fierce spark, in the way Molly sometimes still reached for an extra mug out of habit, and then smiled sadly and used it herself. Some losses carved holes that never fully filled, but around those holes, life grew. Different than before, shaped by absence, but still reaching toward the light. And on quiet nights when snow fell softly on the garden and the house was full of people who loved one another despite, and because of, everything they'd endured, you could almost hear it. The echo of Fred's laughter. Not accusing, not demanding, just reminding them that joy wasn't betrayal. It was what he'd wanted all along.